Hi, folks. Welcome to Smart Simple Fit. Today, I have the pleasure of being joined by Fazlifts. He is a very experienced guy in the field of fitness, between coaching and also powerlifting and bodybuilding himself. He's very knowledgeable and he has a very impressive physique and level of strength. So I'm glad he could be here to join me to talk about all kinds of different things, natural lifting, training volume, exercise progressions. We're going to get into a lot of different topics. And to start things off, Faz is going to tell us about his backstory, what got him passionate about lifting in the first place, maybe some of the exercises he's focused on, how things have changed in his approach, what got him into coaching, things like that. So, Faz, thanks for joining me. How are you today?
I'm really good. And Davin, can I just say thank you for having me on as a guest? Really appreciate it. It's nice to finally speak. We've interacted on
Yeah,
social
yeah.
media quite a lot. So I always like, having these chats with people, and it's really nice to get to know people more. So I do appreciate you having me on. So thank you again. Cool.
Awesome.
So
All right. Yeah, yeah. Tell us all about yourself, Faz.
yeah, so right. So we'll take it back from the beginning. I started lifting properly, I would say 1999. I did do a few years in my home gym, but I generally say to people I started properly lifting 99, mostly because I was getting injured quite a lot when I was playing football, soccer, because I was quite fat. So not very good to play sports when you're fat. Ankle starts to roll, things go wrong. So I just sort of slipped into the gym. My elder brother landed a bunch of bodybuilding magazines on my lap and said, "Hey, have a read of these while you're rehabbing." And I got to liking some of the articles, which made sense, but also one book, a book which is called Brawn by a guy called Stuart McRobert, who you may have heard of. He had a whole thing called The Hard Gainer for a long time. And so I thought, hey, this book makes sense. So I purchased it. It got sent over. And he was talking a lot of sense. Back then, I was very heavily influenced by Dorian Yates and the hit culture, because growing up around here, I'm in the middle of England, what we call the Midlands, and it's a huge Dorian influence. I'm an hour away from the original Temple Gym. So it was all kind of similar stuff, very, very gritty, hard, heavy basics, focus on the compounds, and inherently it just made sense to me. So that was kind of my opening to effective training. I started lifting well, and to sort of cut to the chase, I found out I was actually quite strong. So I started to fairly rapidly increase in size and strength. I had a good burst of initial size and strength. By the end of the first year, I was benching about 90 kilos, about 200 pounds, which is not much, but I was squatting 3 plates and I was deadlifting about 4 to 4.5. So I thought, well, a natural consequence is, why don't I compete? And I wanted to compete in something. Now, at the time, Davin, um, natural bodybuilding wasn't really a huge thing, certainly not around here. And you were fairly limited in your options. And I wanted to compete because all my friends competed in something, or, for me, it was no different than lads doing a five-a-side football, or 11v11 for football for a local football team. So it was no different from that. I didn't think competing was anything particularly special. But I thought, well, everyone else is doing something, badminton, football, whatever it is. So I want to do something too. And this is my thing. So I went and competed, and I realized I was pretty good. And I loved it. I absolutely loved it. The community of people was awesome. I competed in powerlifting and strongman in that first year, and it was I was addicted right from the beginning. It was fantastic. And in the first couple of years, it was just a case of just competing for the fun of it. And then eventually I got quite competitive. Now, over the years, just to fast forward a bit more, I competed in powerlifting for 14 years altogether. Did relatively well, made lifts of 255 on the squat, 180 on the bench, and 300 on the deadlift at a body weight of 93. I did most of my lifting between 83, 93, and 105, but I mostly stuck around 93 kilos. Did strongman a couple of times. Then I mostly kind of retired from training powerlifting style training in 2014. For a few years, just sort of didn't do much in terms of competitive stuff. And I didn't really enjoy that period of my life because I felt quite young. I was like 34, 33, but I wasn't doing anything that I felt was competitive, and I liked to compete. So it was at that point I started coaching some more. And around about 2018, that was when I did my first bodybuilding show, which was a lot of fun. And yeah, I've been coaching now for about sort of 10 years. So yeah, I think that was a bit of a sort of a ramble of my last 25 years of coaching and training. But hopefully that gave you guys a bit of an introduction to who I am. But feel free to sort of prod me for specifics.
Yeah, absolutely. So you had mentioned the initial motivation, right? you saw you're overweight, you saw that was conducive to injuries, you wanted to make a big change. So throughout that, that first year or two of lifting, how much did your body weight like decrease as you were, getting stronger? Like how did that, a common topic these days is like recomposition. Is it possible to, gain
Mm.
muscle and lose fat at the same time? Was that part of the experience, or did you have distinct phases or
Yeah, so I definitely had a distinct phase. So 2009, 1999 was when I lost about 50 pounds of fat, and I mostly did that through just a lot of cardio. I was at the point where I was doing an hour and a half of cardio a day, and just some very light weights at the local like council gym, just on machines. So it wasn't really bodybuilding, but I lost a tremendous amount of weight. And then in 2000, when I got this book and I started training properly, that's when I regained about 40 pounds with heavy training. So the routine was relatively minimalistic. And I know you want to get into volume later, but the volume was what I recommend most of my beginners do. And it's a low amount of volume. It was about 4 to 6 sets per body part per week. But combined with that weight gain and combined with a heavy focus on the basics that I really wanted to get strong, I put on a ton of muscle. Davin, my routine in those early days was so basic. So day one was I would do bench or dip, not both, bench or dip, chins, overhead press, and if I felt a little bit cheeky, I would do some arm work. Right, that's it. It was like my treat to myself. Then on the other day, I would do a squat, a partial deadlift, and then some calf work and ab work, and that's it. Usually for a couple of sets each. It was super basic, and I would train 3 to 4 times a week, and that's it. But it meant I was fully recovered for every session, and I was gaining. And in those early stages, when I couldn't squat twice a week, what I did was I would have one day which was squat and partial deadlift, and another day which was leg press and deadlift, and I would just alternate. But again, super basic, same calf work, same ab work, and the upper body day I could generally repeat for a while, but eventually I started to mush that out and did it. I did dips and chins and overhead press on one day, and the other day was bench and row and dumbbell overhead press on the other day. But again, super basic, big focus on barbells and dumbbells rather than machines. And I'm not saying that's the right way to go about things, because I don't necessarily train all my beginners with barbells all the time, because I think machines have got quite a lot of value. It's just what I did, and it worked really well for me.
Yeah, fantastic. And it's funny that you said the 4 to 6 sets. As we'll probably get into, more of like the variable discussion. And for anyone who's seen any of my videos talking about training variables, I try not to give too hard and fast of prescriptions. I think it contradicts the idea of like a concept of what a variable is in the first place. But that being said, I do tend to recommend somewhere right around 4 to 6 sets per week, maybe a little bit less, maybe a little bit more, depending on the exercise and the person. But I find that very interesting. So speaking of that being sort of more like maybe a beginner program that you'd recommend now, and seeing the results that you got back then, what has changed in your program since then? Has there been a greater emphasis on isolations, less focus on barbells? What's your current routine compared to that?
I mean, current routine now is very different, I would say, just because I'm older now and I'm training around some injuries and stuff. But I think what's probably very relevant for the audience is what I did to push past my first major plateau. I think it's quite interesting. So I plateaued at about a 90 kilo bench. And I was on about a 160 kilo squat, 3.5 plates. Deadlift was at 5 plates at this point, but I had a hard stall, and nothing that I did could fix it. Nothing with my diet. My diet was spot on. I was gaining weight, absolutely nothing. I just couldn't push past this. It was a true plateau. It wasn't a plateau via food. It was an actual training plateau. Now, at the time, what I was involved in this low volume community where I was doing 4 to 6 sets, and at the time, I was told I'd reached my genetic limit. So yeah, it's crazy, right? I mean, they said, look, you've got a 90 kilo bench, that's it, you're done. And I thought, wow, it's crazy. But anyway, what I needed was to increase volume. Now I look back on it and it seems very obvious, but at the time we didn't have a great deal of information on the internet. We have so much better information now. Everyone comes up with huge, swaths of information, sometimes too much, but it means that, at the time it was very difficult for me to conceptualize this idea that, well, similar to education, I used to be a school teacher. If you're putting in X number of hours revising for a certain exam and things aren't going right, well, let's maybe try and amp it up a little bit. Let's do some revision classes at lunchtime. Let's do some after school classes. Let's put in a bit more work. And sounds really obvious now, but what I needed was to do a little bit more. And I eventually moved up to pressing quite a lot per week. I think looking back now, probably too much, but I was young, I could handle it. But ramping up my volume of pressing, barbell pressing during the course of the week is really what pushed me to my first 3-plate bench and also 5-plate squat, and deadlift went up to about 5.5 plates at that point. So I had to increase the amount of stimulus to make my muscles respond more, and it was proportionally more for the areas where I wasn't genetically gifted in. So in my pressing muscles, and I think in general, unless you're very gifted in pressing, people generally need more pressing than they do lower body stuff. Lower body stuff tends to respond to lower volume. So my squat was moving in the right direction, and that was the volume thing. However, there was a rub with that, so I'll add this in. I realized with that, you have increased recovery demands. So what I started to implement was my very first periodization, a very, very early method of periodization, a very simple, very raw method of periodization, which was just to take deload weeks. So I actually contacted Dan John. And back then he was a huge personality on the internet, and I was just some dumb kid from England. And I didn't think this guy from America was going to message me back, but I emailed him. I remember it was 12 o'clock on like a Tuesday or something. And he emailed me back 3 p.m. So just a few hours later, he emailed me straight back. And he said, look, what I want you to do is I want you to go through your training diaries, and I want you to see if you see any patterns about when you run into stalls. And sure enough, I looked back through 2 years of training diaries, all paper logs. And yep, every third week or so, something would happen. So I emailed him back and I said, Dan, this is what I found out. So he said, look, what I want you to do is I want you to implement deloads. So alongside the increased workload, I was able to do a sort of a super compensation and then deload and then consistently gain muscle and strength. So if you're familiar with my work, you know that I've defended deloads for a long time, mostly because coming from that background, I needed almost too much volume and then to super compensate to deload and come back. And I know they're not really in vogue anymore, but again, all I can do is share my experience. I know what the other people say. I know what the science says, all that kind of stuff. But all I can really do is share my experience, and that's what I try and do on my channel. So for a long time, I very much defended deloads, and I said everyone should do them because of that's what worked. That's what got me from a 90-kilo bench to eventually, in those early days, up to about 2007, it was about 150-kilo bench, like 330 pounds, and then I went on to do more. But that was when I got bigger. But they were crucial for me. So it was a combination of ramping up the volume, but then also implementing the first bit of periodization that I did, which to do some deloads. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, your bench press genetics got way better. That's great.
Yeah, doubled my limits. Yeah.
That's right. Awesome. Yeah. Well, and I like to have, I don't like throwing around the term nuance without actually like giving a meaningful explanation. But I think with the deload is a perfect example of it is a tool that works extremely well. I would probably tend to fall more into your side of the discussion on deloads, that they're extremely useful. However, I would qualify it by saying that there has to be requisite effort. And by effort, I don't just mean like RPE. So in your case, it was a combination of, the sets, the number of exercises, and obviously volume, right? You see that increased volume is a higher stimulus, but just as you had mentioned before, it came at a higher recovery cost, and you're seeing these stalls come in. You go, okay, well, given the current training circumstances, it would make sense to scale back, just as this gentleman is suggesting. And when you did that, it helped. It helped enormously, but there was like a prerequisite of a certain combination of effort, through that combination of variable prescriptions. And that's what made it make sense under those circumstances. Yeah. And where if I go to the other side of the fence and I give a defense for someone saying, deloads are overrated, if you're not a power lifter or blah, 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 whatever their explanation is, that there are certain circumstances where it's not necessary. I can defend that as well and say, yeah, sometimes people they're just pushing themselves enough along where if they train at a frequency of 2 times per week and they're only accumulating 1 rep on a certain weight every other session or something like that, they're putting in the effort, but they're not really pushing it to the edge. They're not like, you're very competitive, but they don't have that competitive spirit. So if they're not pushing themselves to the edge, they might not be at that level, that threshold where their attempted progression is outpacing their actual recovery. And so if they haven't outpaced themselves, then maybe there isn't a need to deload. Now, what's the cost? Well, you have the recovery cost in the scenario where the deload's beneficial, and you have the extra gains. They have the slower gains, and less of a recovery cost. So it's sort of like these things balance out in a sense. Now, there's probably going to be some disagreement among people about whether that's better or not, but I think there are definitely circumstances where you can keep going along for a really long time without experiencing a true plateau, especially like you said, when sleep's dialed in, nutrition's dialed in, the effort's there, the quality of the reps is there. And like just speaking to my own training experience, let me give you an example where I found deloading to not be necessary. And maybe this is peculiar. Maybe this is my genetic strong suit. You know that the machine that goes in and out, the abduction, adduction?
Yeah.
So for
Good
me,
girl, bad girl.
that's right. The good girl, bad girl. Well, I'm a very good girl. I'm very good at closing my thighs. So building up that one has been, I mean, to say that I program for it would be like such an exaggeration. I close it and I open it. That's my program, and I do it until I can't anymore. And I remember even in high school, like I was maxing out the stack for reps. I eventually got off of training when I was in college and got back really into a good fitness program, but I've never struggled in any way, shape, or form to move more weight or more reps on that one. And I think there's a certain sweet spot where with exercises, part of the problem with progress being stalled comes down to how hard is it to lift another pound? Like, for example, a bicep curl, you are less strong. So every pound makes a bigger difference than bench press. On squat, every pound makes less of a difference than bench. On leg press, where you're 2 to 3 times stronger than a squat, lifting 1 extra pound, it's almost imperceivable in some circumstances. So some of it just comes down to, is this like mechanically a very easy exercise? And if so, getting that extra pound or that extra rep might not be difficult. Currently, what I do for adductor, I train it 3 times per week. I do 1 set after a warm-up set, and I always work as hard as I can. And it's about like 10 to 15 reps. And even now at like a fairly advanced stage where it's like the entire stack, a decent range of motion, enough that I'm not really flexible enough to get in the position, but if I swing my legs, I can get into that position. And I'd put a dumbbell on top of the stack and just like always work harder. And even in the last like several months, I haven't experienced a stall yet, and I've just been pushing it. But that being said, if I were to do that on bench press, not going to work. I know that for me, that's not going to work. It's like you said, that's probably a commonality of pressing is going to take a little more than like the legs. So, anyways, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. Is there a flip side where deloading is overrated or not advised, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah,
on that?
I mean, a lot of stuff there. I think
Yeah,
a lot of thoughts I've got there. So I think first of all, um, I can probably steer this conversation towards different recovery systems. So one of the kind of workouts that I really promote is full body frequently, and I think one of the key factors in making full body work is understanding that you have different recovery systems in the body. There are different things which recover at different rates. So what you're describing is machine exercise, which is an isolation, relatively gentle on the body. Now, the whole point of machines is that they are there to fatigue just your muscles and not your joints, ligaments, probably a nervous system, because it's a fairly small exercise. Now, you have the opposite end of that where you have like barbells, which are probably a little bit less forgiving. And and especially with relatively heavy weights that I was using at the time, that causes other systems in the body to come into play, and you have to account for the recovery of those. So just to kind of loosely categorize them into 4 different categories. So going from the quickest to recover to the least quickest to recover, I would say muscles will be the quickest, recover extremely fast within daily. I train daily most of the time if I'm doing full body. Then you have ligaments, connective tissues. I think your central nervous system as well, just in terms of the overall sort of fatigue of a session when you do squats, heavy benches and stuff. And then finally, bones, but I don't think they're really relevant. So the first 3 are relevant when it comes to planning high frequency training, or any frequency really, just to be aware of. So I think when you have a very barbell-based routine, by necessity, you have to think a lot more carefully about your recovery, especially if you're trying to run with fairly low reps, as I was at the time, perhaps more ballistic performance of the exercise to try and lift as much weight as possible. And this sort of rolls into one of the reasons why I'm not like a huge fan of a sort of a mix, of powerlifting and bodybuilding, like I've discussed before. I don't think we want to get into that today, unless you really want to. But the power building approach, just simply because you tend to leverage this very stressful way of training for muscle growth. And that in the context of what we're just talking about here, it doesn't make any sense, because you are going to limit your muscle growth, because your muscles are going to be limited, because you will be limited by your ligaments and your joints. It makes more sense to do useful volume, kind of like what you're doing with the adductor machine, with joint-friendly exercises, which really emphasize the muscles. But that was the first thing I thought of. The other thing I thought of was something you said about nuance. One of the reasons that I like your account on Instagram and I like your posts and your videos is you do talk about nuance quite a lot, which I really like. And I tend to find it's a sign of somebody who actually works with people and coaches people. They think about nuance quite a lot. And you asked me before we got on air if there's anything that I've changed my mind on. And yeah, I mean, there is tons. I'm going to release a video soon about some modifications that I've been making to my own training, but also training of some of my clients. And I released a book on this actually last year. It was called Out of Shape, Out of Look, Out of Time. And one of the main variables in that was rest periods and repetition ranges. And I think we are told quite a lot about what's optimal and what we should be doing. And if you look at this paradigm, generally people go for relatively moderate reps, so like 5 to 15, something like that. Also range of motion, people tend to go for fuller range of motion. Intensity, people tend to go for fuller, like more intensity. And rest periods, people tend to go for more rest periods. So at every juncture, we have these variables which are almost set in stone. Like you must train to failure. You must do maximum range of motion. You must do this repetition range, and you must take loads of rest between sets. And I've been playing around with that because I think hypertrophy is a very forgiving endeavor. And I think there's nuance in terms of being able to do an effective workout for you as an individual, like with injuries, for example, different goals, while training for hypertrophy. Like me, for example, my lower back is a little bit banged up because I had a biking injury a few years ago. So I have to make some modifications for that. That is, now I'm able to squat now and deadlift, but I use a reduced range of motion. I also don't go to failure. Not that people go to failure on squats and deadlifts anyway, but generally lower back movements. I also tend to use repetitions which are higher than most people might do. I also tend to use shorter rest periods, which allows me to work more on the condensation, the density of the workout for that exercise rather than all out weight. So there can be a lot of nuance because hypertrophy is so forgiving, but all too often we tend to be boxed into these recommendations, and we're all guilty of it because as much as we sort of rebel against like science and anecdotes and all those types of things, well, we're all influenced. I mean, you look at some of the various trends, and over the years, I try and rally against it. And I've only been on YouTube for a very short amount of time, but I've seen some of these trends come in from the science space, and a lot of them lead to dead ends. And I rally against it with a very skeptical eye. Like, for example, there was the NPS research in 2015. Everybody overnight declared that bro splits were dead and high frequency was the way forward. And that was a dead end. We had the overhead tricep work sort of stuff. Everybody, before you knew it, every like 135-pound beginner on Reddit was talking about the long head of the triceps overnight and said, you have to do overhead tricep work. Again, there's nuance in that as well. I had a massive long head of my triceps, all from benching. I never did any overhead work. I never even pressed overhead when I was a powerlifter. I never did overhead tricep extensions, but my triceps were massive because I benched 4 plates. So, like it's going to do that for you. Like, oh, well, you're not going to develop a long head. Like, do people really think I was benching 180 with 180 kilos with a relatively close grip just by virtue of my medial tricep? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. So I rally against a lot of these trends, and I think there's nuance, and I think there's a lot we don't understand about the body. But anyway, I rebutted with an equally long ramble, so there you go.
Good. Oh, that's good. There's a lot of good stuff in there, and I think well, your last point I found very, very compelling because I resonate with it. Is that you see trends and they go up and then they die and then they go up and then they die, and people have they fixate over a thing like this. We've got it this time. We found the thing that matters. Like, no. There's a bunch of things that matter, but not to beat a dead horse, as everyone's already heard, your consistency, your effort, your progression model. Like, there's things that are just in an inescapable foundation of any good routine in training, any good system or mode of thought about training, and you can't escape those. but the tool you use, the rep range, how many days off of training, how many minutes between sets, yeah, there's plenty of room to play with it. And one of the things I talked about, I did a video, I called it my lecture on training variables. I don't know if you saw that one, but
It's a good
basically
one.
what I was
I like
getting
it.
at, thank you. What I was getting at is that if you can understand fundamentally that there are, obviously there are relationships between the variables. If you can understand how they interact with each other, then you set yourself up to make decisions that make a lot more sense than if you just pick your numbers off the internet or off of a study or some guy who's does have good training experience, but for a number of reasons he's different from you, right? And the worst part is if you go to one guy and ask for the volume prescription and then go to the science to ask for the intensity prescription and this, now you have fixed
Yes.
prescriptions for something that's supposed to be variable by definition, which means it's subject to change. So you have
And
different
that always
prescriptions.
that always ends
Yeah,
up
it's
being
just oh,
that always ends up being the maximum of everything. It
right,
always ends
right,
up
right.
being like
Yeah,
everyone says, like max intensity, max volume, max range of motion. Like
max
you do all
frequency.
three, you're gonna get
Yeah.
hurt.
Oh, totally,
And
totally. Yeah.
I like that video. I like the video. It was a good video. Mm.
Thank you. Yeah. So for
I
sure.
wanted to ask you a question. While we're talking about this point, did you
Yeah.
see the post that Trained by JP put up about science, where he basically he did it on a story, and he said he ignores science. Science guys can't teach us anything. And then Dr. Pack did a rebuttal where he basically memified his answer and said, well, he kind of made out JP to be a knucklehead and said, well, it just he did that science thing of saying, well, you're dumb, we're right. And Lane Norton
Yeah.
got in as well, and he's like, ha, JP, you played yourself. And I thought it really disappointed me, Davin, because you've got these guys like Trained by JP is in the trenches, right? He does everything he possibly can because he's a lifter. So does Dr. Pack, he's a lifter. So does Lane. They're all lifters in their own
Oh
right.
yeah.
They're very good.
They're
But
all impressive.
they're all impressive.
They clearly
But
know what they're talking about.
yeah, but the thing is, you put them on the internet, and it's all about gotcha. I owned you, science bitch. It's like, grow up, bro. Like we're not 5 anymore. Like you and I, as coaches, we're just trying to give people reasonable prescriptions. But it seems like as soon as people get on, I never experienced this when I was powerlifting. In person, everybody was just really nice to me, and it was a great community. But it seems like as soon as people get on social media and they have some kind of a following, they just devolve into absolute children, and it doesn't help anyone. It really disappointed me in all 3 of them. Maybe not with JP because he was just exasperated, but Pack's reaction disappointed me, and Lane's reaction really disappointed me.
Well, this is the background of Faz, the school teacher, coming out. He's ready to slap a wrist.
Seriously, yeah. Yeah,
awesome.
It was disappointing.
Yeah, no, I didn't see that particular post, but I know exactly what you mean, and I don't want to paint with a broad brush and say that the science guys are worse at being condescending or something like that, or you're straw manning their opponents or something. But there's something about this kind of the chip on the shoulder of the the PhDs is like up here. You're carrying it around to show it off. It's like the belts in professional wrestling, right? With the gold sticking out. Like, yeah, that's right.
Did you ever see that,
drive, sucker?
Did you ever see that interaction between Lane Norton and Dorian Yates years ago? It's been memified as well. So,
oh wow,
Dorian was talking about something or another, and he was stating his opinion on his page, and Lane came in and said, "Have you got anything to back that up?" And Dorian said, seven multiple Mr. Olympias. Like, that's it. It was the best. I mean, I don't normally like respond in that way because it's like I'm bigger than you, but it was just brilliant. Yeah, it was great. So it's been, you can look it up because you'll find a picture of the original conversation because people loved it at the time. It was like 15 years ago. It's great.
Yeah, I got to keep up with the lore. I thought I had like dove into the lore of like fitness on the internet. There's some things I'm missing out on, clearly.
I could share some things. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's like I really like Lane Norton because he's clearly a smart guy. He's clearly put in a ton of work. He's very strong. I would have more respect for him and admiration for him on the basis of like his size and his strength and a lot that he's gone through and the entrepreneurship and that sort of thing, rather than just like the formal education itself. But you can see this, and to be fair, I look back at my own training and go, this is a stupid thing. Why was I doing it? So I think we all are going to learn from, and hopefully that's part of our individual journey in fitness and as coaches too, right? We're shaving away the things that are dumb and the things that are arbitrary and the things that don't make sense. And I look at what the science crew is doing sometimes, and I'll be very curious to hear your thoughts on this. I'm going to try not to again, I don't think people are stupid for following the scientific trends. I just think the forest is missed for the trees. The velocity training thing, where it's like you attach something to your barbell and you do a deadlift, and then you log the velocity of the deadlift and somehow infer from that information about like recovery and strength and programming, rather than just go that sucked. That was a grinder, or just film it. Be like, that was a complete grinder and it looked like trash. Like it's almost like they don't trust their intuition, that they need to like put more numbers in it. What are your thoughts on this whole velocity training thing?
Well, I had two thoughts when you were talking about with the velocity training thing. I've not heard of it, but all I'll say is no one who's actually strong does that, so you can dismiss it pretty quickly. But there's two things I thought of when you were talking. First of all, I am very pro science. You know, like when I was in education, as a school teacher, I did my master's in teaching. I also started what we call it's the equivalent of a PhD. It's the EDD, education doctorate in teaching as well. So I'm very pro science. I did my own research, but so when we, and I just want to make sure the audience understands this. When I talk about the science in bodybuilding, I'm not anti-science. My life is very pro-science. Where I am is the current dawn of the hypertrophy research superstar. That's what I really rally against. That's the first point. So I'm not anti-science by any means whatsoever. And I think it's very important that people understand that and they make that distinction, because if you are on social media and somebody says to you, you're wrong because science says so, it's like, well, no, your hypertrophy science, which is actually an infant in the grand scheme of things, because you and I know hypertrophy science has only really been formalized over the last 15 years. It's a baby. So we can't use that to go, science. It's like, no, it's very much in its embryonic stages right now. So just because you reject what some of the hypertrophy crew says doesn't mean you're anti-science. It means you are actually if you're skeptical about the current gung-ho way that some of these researchers deliver their science, you are actually more scientific than they are, because you are truly showing a skeptical eye, which is what you're supposed to do. And any researcher in the field, like when I was doing my EDD, when I was talking to professors about my project, they were all highly skeptical about data and very, very cautious and slow in the way that they provided conclusions for large-scale data. I mean, those things come after decades. Yeah. We've only had hypertrophy research really only started with Matthias Wernbaum in 2009, and it's now 2023. It's a baby. So where I think the first point I'm saying is, where I think this goes wrong is hypertrophy research is very much in its embryonic stages, but we are matching that with the dawn of the hypertrophy research superstar who is monetarily involved. Now, I'm not accusing anyone on everything or anything. All I'm saying is we cannot be gung-ho, because that is not how science works. We have to be skeptical, because that is truly being scientific. The second thing I want to say is, when people get angry about the science, you have to bear in mind, you are looking at a very small slither of hypertrophy research. Now, you look at the research of somebody like James Steele, James Fisher from the UK, you look at Matthias Wernbaum, there are plenty of researchers out there who we don't see on social media because they are not superstar researchers. If you actually read the research, there is plenty of research and plenty of studies done by actual, well, I won't say actual because that's maybe a bit unfair, but quieter researchers, who are slowly doing quality work using tools like Cochrane to make sure that they are performing studies with a good degree of accuracy. So when people get annoyed by the research, I have to remind them, apart from the first point, I have to remind them it's only a small slither of the research. If you actually are interested in the science, then go ahead and look at the work of Fisher and Steele in the UK. Go ahead and look at Wernbaum. It's very sensible recommendations, pretty much what you and I would recommend all of our clients do. And I know that because I look at your material. So people should broaden out their view. And if they're just going on social media and getting angry about the current crop of research superstars, firstly, don't do that, because it's not a good, there's no point looking at things and getting angry about them. But if you truly want to look at the research, go into the archives, look at the research. I mean, it's harder now because they've shut down that website which used to give you free articles. But you can find places. I would just urge you not to take the small slither of current Instagram researchers,
The noisy ones.
the noisy ones. As look, Fisher and Steele. I had James Steele on my podcast. He's really sensible, really sensible. Matthias Wilmer, I want to get him on my podcast. He's a legendary researcher in the field, and he's still active. Yeah, just 2 points I thought were worth bringing up at this point. I don't class myself as anti-science, but I don't like the current dawn of the hypertrophy research superstar. And also, there is plenty of good research out there which nobody really gets exposed to because they aren't that noisy, they aren't that visible.
Yeah, yeah, and I would say this too is something that I try and encourage people, and this is my own sort of like, as you mentioned, the skeptical mind approaching science itself. It can't be. There's a term, scientism, right, where it's almost like you're worshiping like science itself. It becomes an idol that you like bow down to and worship. I think that's part of the problem is the level of elevation that science itself is given to. But if you come at it with the skeptical mind, right, you're looking for things that make sense and things that can be explained well. So, like for example, one of my favorite videos on science was this was one done by Steve Shaw, who I think you're a fan of. I quite like Steve Shaw.
And super friends,
yeah. It was a video talking about a what sounded like a really good study investigating different types of splits. And what they had discovered was that when you control for training tonnages for the same person, dividing the work up differently between the splits didn't seem to produce much of a difference. And if I'm not mistaken, even one of the videos was maybe slightly favorable for a bro split, like the higher, like the tonnage being condensed and then with more rest time. So that makes sense. And the way I would explain it is organizing the same work differently across the same period of time. It doesn't stand to reason that it would do anything different, right? Like in the same way you're talking about increasing, you'd use the example of studying, right? Like more time studying to do better on the test. More time studying, I'm not convinced that it needs to be, that there's a magic way of dividing it up. I can speak from experience. People have told me, as you've probably even told your students, don't cram. Well, a bro split is kind of like cramming. I can tell you from experience, cramming works if you pay attention. Cramming doesn't work if you spend 3 hours on social media and then study for an hour and then go back to social media for 3 hours. That's bad cramming, right? Just like if you're in the gym and you're supposed to have like all these sets and stuff and you're goofing around or you're fluff and pump instead of actual hard work. So yeah, I think it would make sense that the same work, it provided it's across the same time, same nutrients, same sleep, it's probably going to have very, very similar results. Maybe there's some difference, but not a massive difference. So where the scientific findings can be explained in a way that seems logical and just very reasonable, I tend to trust it. And where I get skeptical is where you have, like you say, the superstars. I'm not afraid to name him at this point. I don't hate him. Maybe it seems like I hate him, but Menno Henselmans, I have to name you again. He has these posts where it's like there's supposedly this dramatic difference between something that isn't explained in a way that makes sense, like the way he presents stretch-mediated hypertrophy, which, I mean, as far as a concept, I'd love to hear your thoughts on. My thoughts on stretch-mediated hypertrophy doesn't make sense. A lot of the studies that supposedly demonstrate it are just like ludicrous. So, for example, putting someone in a device to force them to stretch for hours and then only adjusting it when they can't bear the pain of the stretching. You do that for like 5 hours, 7 days a week, and it's like, oh, we measured some muscle growth. Okay, well, wait a second. Let's think about this. If stretching causes a contraction, right? It's like a defensive contraction, and that contraction is very gentle. It's not like bending over, you get a stretch, but it's not a very intense contraction. Well, a copious amount of gentle contractions causing a little bit of muscle growth doesn't tell me anything about some magical mechanism in the body. What would make sense is the thing we've always been taught, and this is even like scientific, right? Like you break down the muscle through hard work, and with sufficient recovery, it'll be better, right? And with a sufficient stimulus, sufficient recovery. Like that's what it comes down to. The idea that there's some kind of a additional mechanism through stretch. I just stand unconvinced. So I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. On the last point, that might have been disproven actually, but if it's okay, I'm gonna push back a little bit on what you've said, because I think we're delving a little bit too far into maybe a point of view that I don't actually agree with. And my stance is that I don't think lay people should actually try and interpret the research.
Yeah, that's fair. No, that's totally fair. Yeah.
Because I think what tends to happen is like what you said earlier. What tends to happen is if you have a research article which you jive with, you will tend to agree with that. If you have a research article which you're skeptical against, you will tend to disagree. So what happens is a lot of researchers, and I'm not accusing Steve of doing this, but certainly what a lot of YouTubers do is they will pick studies which suits their point, and they'll make a video about it and go, hey, this is what the science guys have said. They've owned themselves because they were saying this all along. Now this study has been come up to disprove them. Or they'll pick a study which they think sounds ridiculous and they'll make an argument against that. Now, that's also not a scientific process. It's also not how you do science. So my problem is with that, and why I'm pushing back on it, they're using science to drive home their personal bias. That is not scientific. So if we're going to do that, we are effectively just lying to our audience. We shouldn't be doing that. It is intellectually dishonest to do that. So I no longer discuss studies on my podcast simply because I do not have the time to go through all the studies with a fine-tooth comb, and nobody on the space that we currently work in does. People sometimes have the arrogance to think that they do, and the audience will believe it because it suits their bias. I think it's intellectually dishonest for a YouTuber who also is a coach and who isn't actually a researcher, who doesn't understand the way research works, to go and try and use a study to prove his point. All that is doing is misleading your viewers, not yours, because you don't do this, but is misleading viewers because you're just playing up to a bias. So I'm very much against people using science and abusing science. Like, I conducted research in the field of education. I can talk you through what my thesis was, and I conducted research on that. I know how to conduct research. I know how to read educational research. Now, yes, I'm relatively familiar with hypertrophy research as well, but I'm not a researcher anymore. And the consequence of when people do this is they enter into that hypertrophy superstar researcher realm. By doing it, they do it themselves. The very thing they're rallying against, they do it because all they're doing is they're taking this innocent baby, which is science, and they're abusing it and throwing it around like a weapon. They're weaponizing science. So, while we are sat here and we're sort of saying we shouldn't be research superstars, we shouldn't be listening to the research superstars, we also can't engage in that, Davin. We can't, and if we pick a study and go, well, this study said this contradicted this makes sense to me, we are engaging in the very same act that we dislike. We cannot do that. It's misleading our audience. So I do push back on that a little bit, and I don't like that angle of conversation because I don't agree with it.
Right. Well, look, if it at least makes my case a little bit. At the time when I had saw that, I was actually shocked by it, and so it actually pushed back against my biases. I saw that, when you control for tonnage, you get similar results from a different organization, a different work. It's logical.
To clarify, I very much like your content, so it's nothing about you. What you
said.
No,
for sure. But it's like you said, there is a trend to lean into your own biases, and that's something that natural hypertrophy. I'm sure you're more than familiar with his content too. He said, like him a lot, you'll find someone who you look up whatever, right? You can almost look up the result you want, and if you type in the result you want, especially like NIH, right, to get like the American research, type in the result you want, NIH, and what do you know? Within the first like 5 or 6 Google results, you're probably going to find something that reinforces your biases. Now, I guess a marker of, and I'm getting outside my own lane by saying this, but if I had to play devil's advocate, what would make someone better at making scientific content if they could compare and contrast studies that disagree with each other and investigate what the flaws of those studies might be in order to reach a conclusion that's relatively unbiased. But that's difficult. That's difficult to do that. Like you said, time. That takes a lot of time to do that. To cross-examine the research and compare and contrast what was different about them.
Well, this is what we try and do with meta-analysis and meta-regressions. We try and put together we try and sort of take a point in time and then look at all the research from that area. The diet research is a lot better, Davin. The diet research is a lot better because it's gone on for longer.
Oh yeah.
And there are conclusions we can draw from the diet research. But with the hypertrophy research, one, there just isn't enough time. Probably, and if you look at some of the best meta-analysis before the age of the research superstar, Matthias Wernbaum, he still has very sensible advice. He made the case for roughly, he talked about volume in terms of repetitions, but if you kind of translate it to sets, he was recommending roughly 8 to 14 sets per body part per week, done a couple of times a week, or split a couple of times a week. So, that is on the lower end of the more sensible recommendations. I personally do about 8 to 12 sets per body part per week right now, and I find that's very productive for me. Research does need to move very slowly. I think we're on the right lines. I think there are some people who have motivation to perform research which isn't great, and that is putting us off on the right track. You named a couple of people. I won't say who, but I agree, by the way. But I just think it's up to us as actual coaches and responsible members of this community to rally against people trying to weaponize science. Because the only thing that's going to happen is people are going to get annoyed, and then 5 years down the line, when it's disproved, people are going to get angry and they wasted their time. And you and I know, Davin, we work with people every single day. The last thing we want people to do is waste their time. So we can't engage in the process of weaponizing science, and
waste time or get hurt or hurt themselves.
Yeah, get hurt. I think you and I should basically start this as a movement amongst the natty bodybuilding community and make sure we call that out. I have been doing that. I've been calling out when people have this over reliance on research, because there are swaths of people who refute research wherever it suits them. But then as soon as something comes out which they think, oh, that sounds cool, they get shiny object syndrome and go, hey, you got to do overhead tricep work for long head. Like, bro, calm down. I think you and I should start, pushing back against that. For me personally, because you are a practitioner, I want to hear more about what you have discovered with your clients. I think that's far more relevant in the field. Now, listen, if you and I were in education, great, let's talk research. Fantastic. Love it. Great stuff. But we're not. We are in hypertrophy science, and it's a very green field.
It absolutely is. I only have one more point on research. I think you'll like what I have to say. Is that you said something. This was a few minutes ago about how there is a person who can be skeptical about research or the way certain research is presented, and in a sense, do a better job at thinking in a way that is scientific than the person who is like dogmatic or leaning into biases, or they have something to sell, the superstar, whatever it is. You can be more scientific in a sense, or at least more true to the foundation of like the principles of science. And I totally agree with that. And, part of my problems with research come down to, I have a background in kinesiology, but at the same time, and Sam Sheethar, Sheether, had a very similar experience that I did going formally into university. He said, at the end of the program, I don't think I would have trusted, I like not dumb kids by any means, got along with them well, good friends. I wouldn't trust a single one of them to make an exercise program for my clients, that kind of thing. Right. And I had a very similar experience to that. And if I had to compare and contrast of, who's the shiny star, who's got the A's on all the tests in cellular biology class versus the meatiest meathead, like the biggest, simplest guy in there, who's just like, he's got the biggest bench, biggest deadlift, big arms. His program might not be perfect. Maybe there are some things that are silly. Maybe the exercise selection is a little bit sketchy in some sense. Maybe he's doing some Zerchers and showing off like Eric Bugenhagen that he doesn't really need to be doing. But he's having fun. He's working hard, and he's a lot bigger and stronger than everyone else. If I had to pick, I'm probably going with the meathead guy versus the person who got, that 99% on the.
No, I get what you're saying. Yeah, it's an interesting point. I think the big thing to rally against is dogmatism on either side of the field.
For sure.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I know you've made this point in the past as well, and something I've said a lot in my videos is, and I made a short about it recently, was dogmatism will F you. Like that is the key thing. So I think whether you're on the side of like overly being in science or whatever, I mean, ideally, being evidence-based should be the best combination of the two. The problem is where you get people who pretend to be the research superstars who stop being evidence-based. Evidence-based should be a combination of the research and personal experience. And if somebody is getting absolutely jacked out of their mind doing things one way, but the research says, well, that's not the right way, we can't deny their experience. And people are only going to get their backs up. So, yeah, I think being dogmatic is probably the key. And I said this in a video. I think it was an interview I did with, I forget who it was now, but basically we were talking about dogmatism. And I think a consequence of a coach being dogmatic is, or just saying, giving the impression that they know everything and they can't be questioned. The consequence of that is you basically stall your own development. This is why I'm very, very cautious against that, and why I rally against people even using science now, because they get dogmatic, because all they're doing is they're weaponizing science. So where I think if you're a coach who's dogmatic and you're engaged in these practices of weaponizing science for the sake of getting more views and more likes and more content and people on your side more, I think what you're doing is you're basically telling the world, you know what, I've peaked because I can't learn anymore, because I know it all. If you never allow your audience to come back against you and debate against you and argue back against you, you are basically saying, I've peaked. You might be thinking, I can't afford to be wrong. I can't afford to be seen as being wrong. But actually, the consequence is you're limiting yourself. And as a further consequence of that, you're also limiting your audience. So I think it's crucial that we all learn from each other. I think it's crucial that we all listen to each other. And I try and take feedback from everyone, whether they're old or young. Something you've heard me say probably lots of times is it's never a generational thing. It doesn't matter about your age. You know, I rally against this old man shouting at the cloud thing of saying it was better back in my day. No, it wasn't. I was alive back in your day. It wasn't better at all. We had losers back in our day as well. We have losers now. It doesn't matter about age. It's not an age thing. It's whether you're achieving, whether you're accomplishing, whether you have an open mind, whether you're trying. And I think one of the things that I like about your content is you are willing to entertain other ideas and you're not dogmatic. You're able to learn. I mean, just the fact you have me on your podcast shows that you want to engage in the community, which I think is a great nod to you.
Thank you.
So yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, dogmatism. And when there's like, maybe there's two types of comments that I see. One that rubs me the wrong way, and one that I really like and is a good sign of someone who knows what they're talking about. And it's paradoxical, and it's similar to what you're saying with this dogmatism. So let's say someone leaves a comment on my channel or your channel, or someone makes a video, and their response to criticism, or they're criticizing us, either way, it's the criticism is presented as a very dogmatic, this is the right thing to do, you're dumb because you did the wrong thing, without an explanation of why, without any precautions, right? Of like, oh, you're not doing this exercise, oh, you're not doing this particular technique, this particular rep range, you're wasting your time, bro. That's a hypertrophy range. Like the dogmatic, here's the thing, without any logical explanation of why, or any precaution of, oh, by the way, do this if you try it, or try it, see if it works. Whereas, a good example would be Paris Butler, right? Bald Omni Man. I really like his content.
Yeah.
His response would be to a lot of people, like, asking questions, or maybe even like criticism, would be something like, hey, if you think that's better, try it for yourself and then let me know how it works. Right? Like, that's the sign of someone who knows what they're talking about, actually has an open-ended sort of mindset to it. And you'd think, like, it's almost paradoxical, right? It's kind of like the reverse of like expert syndrome, where it's like, oh, here's this, here's that, here's this, here's that. Absolutely. But the true expert is saying, well, you're right. Maybe that is different in this circumstance. Let me know how that works.
Yeah. and I believe him when he says that, because I think he's genuinely interested in hearing from people.
Yeah. Oh, definitely.
I mean, I'll give you an example of this. I made a video last year, and it was should you overhead press or not? Now, literally the only point I made in that video was that if you are going to overhead press, you need to be aware of the recovery cost. Now, that's it. So I wasn't telling people they must overhead press or they must not overhead press, but the amount of the negative feedback I got from that was insane. Like, literally just even putting that question on the table caused such a visceral negative reaction in some people that makes me think, firstly, I know I'm on the right lines, because when people have those types of visceral reactions to something I say, I know they've not thought about it. They've just reacted emotionally. And if they don't have an actual argument because if my argument was easy to pick apart, then they would pick it apart and they would lay it out saying, you got to do this, you're wrong. And I'll go, okay, fair enough. But often what I find, Davin, is this is a general point throughout life. If you end up seeing something that you don't like and you have a strong visceral reaction to it, you owe it to yourself to dig deep and think about it, because one of two things is going to happen. The first is that you will think about it and you'll pull it apart easily. You'll come back to that person and you'll say, you're wrong because of X, Y, and Z. And they'll go, okay, fair enough. Or maybe they'll correct you further. And then you go back to step one. Or the second thing that will happen is you will think about it deeply and realize, actually, they're logically correct. And as a result, you've grown. But that emotional reaction, that is when I know I'm on the right lines, Davin. When I make a video where it has such a strong negative reaction without any kind of reason, any kind of reasonable reason, which can't be dismissed very easily, then I know I'm on the right lines. And it was the same thing that happened with the power building video recently. There was a huge negative visceral reaction to that, but not one person provided me with a reasonable refutation, not one. But there was a lot of people who were literally just insulting me in the comments, like straight out, insulting me, personal attacks on my wife and all that kind of stuff, like literally just straight up insults, swearing. I didn't delete them. I left them there because I don't do that kind of thing. But
do you ever pin of shame? Like take the worst comment, pin it so everyone can see it.
No. But I don't like to make enemies with that kind of stuff.
Okay,
but right. Like I made a video about Doug Brignall before he passed away as well, a long time before he passed away, and I got a lot of that sort of negativity there. But this is where, whenever something like that happens, I know I've touched on a nerve, but it's a nerve for a reason, because people need to think about things. And again, I'm not dogmatic. I'm happy to be proven wrong. But if somebody can provide me with a reasonable explanation, then I'm happy to listen to it, because I want to improve as well. But yeah, it's really important, I think, when we do have these, because I still have like things that I believe in. I had you asked me again about where I've changed my mind, and I have had these reactions when people talk about deloads, for example, because I'm so passionate about this, and I've had to really think about things and change my mind, or like range of motion, intensity, stuff like that. Even barbell movements. I mean, coming from a 14-year powerlifting career, I was very pro barbell, but I've changed my mind on that too. So yeah, I think to be able to evolve and progress, you have to be able to be willing to engage in thoughts which run counter to your preconceived notions, and realize that, yeah, maybe that person just rocked my world there, and I owe them thank you.
Yeah, well, and I mean, if anyone's like qualified to give a well-reasoned take on power building, which I guess I don't know what your definition would be, and we don't have to get too much into this. I'm sure you're exhausted about talking about
I've covered it ad nauseum now. Yeah,
but it's like I think integral to the discussion is qualifying what we mean. Do we just mean recreationally a program with some barbell movements, including the powerlifting movements, just to get fit and strong and bigger muscles? So I think that can be a big difference between that and, no, I literally am competing or desiring or attempting to compete both, maybe back to back, alternating within the same year. Because and you would come at this from great experience, both in the bodybuilding sphere and powerlifting. Maximizing both in the truest sense is probably where you're going to see the flaws of that philosophy in its greatest capacity, versus, if I take someone who's 45 years old and I say, hey, squat rack is something that's going to fit in your basement, the little 2-piece one or the half cage, like that'll fit in your basement pretty well. Your barbell, get some bumpers, get some other plates. What would be some good exercises that fit the movement patterns? Well, you can do bench press, you do squat. You don't have to do back squat. You could do back squat. You don't have to do conventional. You can do an RDL. You don't have to do 5 to 10 reps. You can do 15 to 20, right? Nice high reps, stuff like that. So it's like, those can be two very different scenarios. That's the only thing. But like, you're qualified to talk about it, in my view, and to insult you personally, especially probably didn't even watch the video. Some of those people. That's
I think a lot of them don't. Yeah.
Keep your personal insults to yourself. People, like, just calm down for like 5 minutes and think.
Yeah, this guy posted like 3 comments in 14 minutes. So he was like just frantically posting while he was watching like at least 15 minutes of it. It was a long video. But yeah, no, I think with that conversation, if people are interested in my point of view, it was a long video. So it's best if they go and watch the video on my channel. Yeah. And again, I'm willing to engage if people have, reasonable refutations. Absolutely. Yeah. Most of the time, what people are describing as power building is just bodybuilding. One of my main points was just I don't really like made up names to sound unique. I'm not a big fan of that. It's it seems to be a scourge in today's modern world to invent names for things and yourself and attach them because you want to feel unique and special. No, I'm the same piece of shit as everyone else. Like, I'm not
Yeah, that's
special.
right. We need a neat little label and stick it on the forehead and
Yeah. I mean,
segregate yourselves by the
yeah.
labels and
Yeah, I think if people want to be stand out, then do something. Do something. I'm not saying I'm any better than anyone for competing, and this is not about competition because one of the reputations somebody said was you're looking at it from a competitive point of view. It's nothing to do with that, but it's just about like actually doing something rather than making up a fancy label and sticking it on yourself. But I rally against that. I mean, coming from the background as a school teacher as well, like I don't like this idea of having participation trophies. Like you didn't do anything to earn this title. You just decided to create a word and slap a label on yourself. Like, well, go out and do something. And if you don't want to do anything, fine, just call yourself a lifter.
yeah,
You're just like the rest of us. You're not special. None of us are. So
yeah,
why are we creating fake names? It makes no sense. But anyway, enough about that. I think if
yeah,
people do
sure.
want to see it, have a watch of my video. It's a long video. I make a lot of points on it, and I think it's best to look at it all because I think it's a complex issue.
Yeah. Well, I think you've seen a good bit of my content that there's
Mm,
too much
yeah.
variety to stick a label on it, right? Like I like calisthenics, I like weighted calisthenics, I like machines. I'm not afraid to use dumbbells. I maybe there's a bit of a heavy focus on barbells only by comparison, but it would be like I don't know, less than half my program is barbell. So is that a barbell program? If like 40% of the exercises are barbell, but then I have a huge mix of other things that make up the other 60%. I don't really need a label to it. It's a fun program and it suits my goals and preferences and what I have access to, right? So
Yeah, I mean, good
yeah,
for you though. You're young, you're growing, so why not?
yeah,
Do use
yeah,
barbells. I mean, yeah, I mean, what built my legs was barbell squats. As much as I
yeah.
wasn't suited to the movement, as much as I wasn't biomechanically efficient, because I'm more of a deadlift build, like long limbs. I
Yep.
can't deny what the squat did for my quads. I mean, blew them up. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, I think you wanted to talk about training volume as well, right?
100%, 100%.
Yeah,
So if
I've
we,
got time, by the way. I'm
yeah,
really enjoying this conversation, so I'm
yeah,
good.
me too. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I appreciate your time. I appreciate your time.
Mm.
Yeah. So as far as training volume, I guess we could branch into other, the discussion of other variables as we go. As we know that there's you can't, and this is one point I made in that variable video is there's no person who has a volume without a frequency and a frequency without an intensity. So it's almost not worth making too heavy of a focus without qualifying it with like if I were to just give you a quick scenario and I were to say, hey Faz, I think a good volume prescription for my new clients who have no background in exercise whatsoever is 4 to 6 sets per exercise, maybe not even muscle group, but per exercise per week, provided that those sets are reasonably close to failure. And the only qualifications there for reasonably close would mean they can't do much more than like 1 or 2 reps on each set if they really tried, and that would be with good techniques. So no, they're not slopping around forcing weight. They're not half repping the last 2 squats in their squat, above like 90 degrees, things like that. So with qualification and then training a couple times a week, each exercise. So if I qualify the statement, then I'm happy to make a volume
Yeah, yeah,
recommendation, but just sort of like in an absolute terms, I think that's hesitate. But
yeah.
no, tell me all your thoughts on training. I recently watched your video. This is a pretty recent video on
Mm.
volume where you had discussed, and feel free to open up and go as deep as you want into this, where you had realized after a discussion with someone that it's not just about reps and sets, there's also volume. That's like the third thing. It was like taking double progression and making it the
Oh yeah,
next
yeah, yeah,
next
yeah,
step, right? So
yeah.
yeah, tell the audience all about that.
Yeah, that was pretty cool. So that was a progression technique that I use with my clients. People have said it's very similar to natural hypertrophy's evolving sets and reps.
Right, right.
But I was on I was on a podcast with Carell recently. It was released yesterday, and clearly NH, if you're watching this, please forgive me, brother, but I'm not. I totally butchered your evolving reps and sets thing. I have not watched his opinion on what it is, but he's landed very close to what I refer to as my method of owning the weight. It's what we called it
Right,
20
right.
years ago. So we've landed. It's very, like he said in his videos, it's very intuitive. But I think if when you first start training, your progress comes very quickly. So you can afford to just add weight to the bar, and it's very easy. You can do
Yeah.
maybe 3 sets of 5, add weight every week or add weight every session, and it's fine because
Mhm.
progress happens quicker. Now, as you get stronger and stronger, you have to account for slower and slower progress. Now, so if people want to conceptualize what we're talking about, we're essentially talking about a way to account for slower progress. That's it. That's at the
Bingo.
heart of it. That's it.
Bingo.
Yes, bingo. Yeah. So we have to account for ways to show people that they're still progressing, because people get kind of nervous if they don't add any weight to the bar. Some objective way that people know they're still on the right track, but progress is just a lot slower. So when I was at my peak, I was maybe adding, I don't know, 5 kilos every few months, as I peaked for a lift, right?
Yep.
And there was a lot of work that I needed to do to get to that point. Whereas as a beginner, might add 5 kilos a session. So all of these approaches that we're about to discuss, they're ways of slowing down progression, but still allowing you to see some progress. So firstly, you would just use single progression, add weight to the bar, all good. You might start with a 45-pound bench, go up to 50, 55, 60, fantastic. Happy days. Maybe you'll get to 135. Things start getting a bit more tricky, session by session. Now, at that point, I would probably introduce a second variable, which would be a range of reps. So if we do 3 sets of 5, well, sometimes you might not get all 5 if you go up in weight. So you might get a set of 5, a set of 3, a set of 2. Okay, so we have a range of reps now. And that means then you would employ double progression. So you would spend some more time at that weight, just building those reps back up to, say, sets of 5. And you would have a range. So firstly, we had single progression. Then we had double progression with the rep ranges. Now, when you get even bigger, and this varies for different people, I could give you some averages if you want, but it varies for different people quite heavily. At a certain point, that won't be enough. So we employ triple progression, which is effectively what me and NH are talking about. And that is, you add the variable of sets. And it's really all about allowing yourself to have these small wins at a certain weight. So you might say, let's say you're on the heady heights of 315 on the squat, and you've just gone up to 315. You went up from, and 315 is like 3 plates aside. You went up from 310, right? Hit three plates. You were doing 3 sets of 5 with 315. You went up to with 305. You went up to 315, and your reps have dropped. Yeah, oh crap! I've got 5 and I've got 2 reps. So this is terrible. Okay, so what you'd do is you'd take some time at 315 and really build out those reps, because if you go up to even 320, so just 5 more pounds, that will just decimate your rep count, and you'll hardly get any effective volume at all. And so what we do is we go from 5 sets of 2, we might build right back up to 3 sets of 5, but we might actually go above and beyond that as well to give us more of a buffer. So we might go to 4 sets of 6. So we've spent maybe 3 months, 2 months, whatever it is, depends how quickly you progress, going from 2 sets of like 2 and 5 at a weight to 4 sets of 6. And depending on how advanced you are for you personally, depends on how long that will take. And then once you're at 4 sets of 6 with 315, well, that jump to 320 is a lot more palatable. So think about it in that sense. Single progression, double progression, triple progression. That is the beginnings of periodization for bodybuilding. There are other things you can do, but that is the beginning.
Awesome. Awesome. Would it be fair to say that, in your view, a large part of what makes long-term, let's call it advanced training. I know people get caught up in the, term, are these good terms? Should we have strength trainers? But I think we know what we're talking about when we say advanced training, right? Especially for the advanced trainee, that long-term progress, a lot of it is contingent on your ability to create in your program some buffer zone, as far as yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think you've got to have it. Definitely. I think people get demotivated very quickly when they feel like they don't see progress. So a classic one is when people are dieting or cutting, bench press strength goes down or plateaus. A lot of time we know it's just a reduced range of motion, all that kind of stuff, or perhaps they lose the ability to perform repetitions on later sets. They go, I'm losing strength, but actually it's just decreased glycogen, decreased muscle endurance, and you have to sort of keep people in check with stuff like that. So you have to make sure people remain confident. We both know as coaches, the mental side of things is huge. So if people, it's like a negative spiral. If people lose faith in the program because they feel they're stalling when they're not, then they stop trying as hard, like minutely stop trying as hard. And that can then lead to a negative spiral where they really start to lose strength and start to lose the muscle. So these methods are crucial for creating that buffer, like you said, which allows people to feel like they're still doing something.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of ways you can negatively spiral. maybe maybe there's a scenario where a guy like really commits to it. It's like, hey, I just need to hammer out these reps at any cost, and then the bum comes up off the bench, and then the bar starts to bounce, and that can be a very precarious situation. Now, that's where a lot of injuries and things like that are going to happen, right? Or people might come out of that experience and go, bench press just wasn't right for me. It just wasn't worth it. Whereas like, well, bench press can be executed better than that. No offense. It's like,
yeah.
I've been guilty of that kind of thing in the past, but it's like how you execute a movement makes a big difference. And then maybe there's another scenario. I've definitely been guilty of this one too. You go, all right, I just need to focus on something else, but you get too far away from that other thing that you really care about, like the squat or the bench. And then you go back to it. You're like, I suck at this thing. Why do I suck at it so bad? And it's like, well, you gave up on it. You could have like blended the two. And some people, and maybe you could tell me your thoughts on this, the term accessory. I like the term accessory lift. It just means I care about something more, and it's a primary focus. If I'm fresh at the start of a session, I'm going to do that one first. Now, the critique on what somebody would have of the term accessory means you don't care about the other one. No. It just means that I'm looking for it to be, going back to machines, easy to recover from volume, something like that. So my pec deck or like doing like the pec deck machine is an awesome machine. I love the way it feels. I'm doing it in a way that feels good for my joints. I know that's helping my chest. That is in addition to my bench press and not at the expense of my bench press. That doesn't mean I don't care about it. I mean, I go to failure and I squeeze that thing together. So it's hard and it's consistent. So it's not that I don't care and I'm just messing around, but it's like combining those two things rather than giving up. So, and just like with the volume, like you said, is a way for you to continue to increase the total session effort and create some buffer zone without just giving up on the movement, right? Or saying, it's your genetic limit. Sorry, Faz. Never going to hit 315 on bench.
Well, I thought a great example of this, just to give him a plug, is Dennis. It's Freaky D or Uncle Freak.
Cheers, Dennis. If you're watching.
Yeah. He's a great guy. I'd like to get him on to have a chat on my channel at some point. But he made a really great post, which I think he actually got some pushback on in some circles, about the relationship between the overhead press and the bench press. Now he's found, like I did, the overhead press had almost zero carryover to the bench press.
They're pretty different movements in my experience. I would say different. In the other way, when I started, sorry to interrupt, but when I started focusing on overhead press like distinctly a couple years ago, actually only like a year and a half ago, I was so weak and I blew up fast. It was like a whole layer of newbie gains because bench press doesn't build your overhead press. So it stands to reason it doesn't really help that much in reverse, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, completely agree. I mean, it was just speaking sort of practically when I was powerlifting, the numbers that I got to, the thing that moved my bench was more bench and bench variations. And so something that, and so he got a lot of pushback on that. People were, I think there was a few people who were saying, they've found the overhead press to work for their clients or something. But I think when you're talking about people who aren't very well developed at all, we're not really talking about crossover at that point. Like nobody would reasonably talk about crossover of a guy who's a beginner, like a guy who's bench pressing a plate aside or even a plate and a half. That's not really appropriate to have the crossover conversation at that point, because they should be training everything anyway. And maybe if you use the overhead press at that point, it might build up the triceps and shoulders. I think the crossover discussion happens when you're actually relatively advanced, maybe late intermediate stage, where all this kind of matters. So I think it's a little bit disingenuous to say, well, like my beginner clients, or I've got clients who improve their bench press by overhead pressing, when what we're actually talking about is just very under muscled beginners just adding muscle. When you're at the level that Freaky D's at, and I never got to that level. He's ridiculously strong, but even at the point where I was benching 4 plates aside, I mean, there was no overhead press was not going to move my bench at all. It doesn't matter how much I did it. All it would do is take away recovery economy from things from the bench press time, and I was benching at least 3 times a week at that point. So it was a lot of benching. The guy who gets this very right is Paris Butler. And he emphasizes good variations, but he emphasizes them only at an appropriate time. In fact, Freaky D actually said to me recently in one of my comments, because I made a video about this topic that you and I are talking about right now, he said that he only actually Larsen pressed after he'd benched 5 plates. So, and I know that Paris has told his clients on Instagram that you shouldn't even be messing with the Larsen press until you've benched 3 plates. So if you're not messing with the Larsen press until you're benching 3 plates, overhead press doesn't even come into it at that point, So No, good, it's good. Good point.
Yeah, very good, very good, awesome. So Now, as far as like progression models, now, what if I were to make a case for expanding on what double progression could be without venturing into triple progression?
Hmm.
All right, so there's three scenarios I want to present to you, and I'll try and go through them briefly without rambling too much. So it's sort of like you've got the weight, you've got the reps, and let's say whatever number of sets you normally train a session, whether it's 2 sets, 3 sets, 4 sets on the bench squat, whatever it is, without adding extra volume or an extra exercise, you can actually make the same double progression, meaning that the only two variables you're really changing are the reps you perform or the weight lifted. There's some extra nuance to it that makes it actually a bit more sustainable, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. So here's scenario number one. You're talking about with bench at the very beginning, hey, 5x5, adding 5 pounds a week, even a session at the very start, every couple of weeks. That's like super duper like doable because your gains are, the diminishing returns. Yeah, it hasn't really caught up to you yet as far as like it's those first like let's say 6 months, very exciting, very exciting. Even the first couple of years realistically are very explosive gains by comparison to I'm sure year 10. But the point is, very explosive gains. Hey, getting 5 pounds on the bench ain't no thing. But what if we took the 1.25 plates and we did 2.5? It stands to reason, at least in my view, that attempting a smaller weight that is objective and measurable is going to allow you to milk a double progression longer. So that's scenario number one. We get less aggressive. You could say when you add the weight progression, the weight is smaller, like measurably smaller. And maybe on some exercise, I would say that's different. Some people might progress their squat and deadlifts. I don't think it's uncommon for people to progress it 10 pounds at a time, in which case back down to 5. Overhead press, barbell curl, bench press, back that 5 pound down to 2.5 total. Now it's a different story. Now you can milk that out longer. Now, scenario number two, this one's also a very simple one that you can change. And that is the frequency of attempted progressions. So if your progressions come down to, I'm just going to add a rep to the same weight, or I'm going to add the weight, except, it's going to cut me down 3-4 reps, and then I'll build back up, whatever your rep range is, evolving rep range, all that stuff. Attempt it less often. So I think it stands to reason that as you and I probably would agree, when a set is high effort, like you're really working hard, it doesn't have to be true failure or beyond failure to be stimulating. Given that this is the case, I think it stands to reason, and I think my experience has played this out, same with my clients, and maybe you can speak to this too. If I do 11 reps at 150 on whatever exercise, doing it the next session is not that big of a deal. Some people might think, oh, I didn't add a rep. It's not that big of a deal. If you couldn't get 12, then you're pretty close to failure. So if you do 11 again, maybe you could have got 12 that day, but then if you save it, 12's the next time, right? You just delay it just a little bit, right? So that's the strategy, basically. Strategy one is decrease the size of the weight progression. Strategy two is decrease the frequency at which you attempt the double progression. And then strategy three, this one's spicy. This one I really like, especially for the exercises where the weights are big, like squats and deadlifts. I need to make a video. I've been wanting to make a video on this one for a while. I think it's interesting. I call it like a flip-flop method, maybe I'll come up with a better term for when you're doing this with like a variety of weight levels. But the idea is pick multiple weight levels and progress them and alternate, right? So, for example, if someone is squatting 225 for 10, and they want to move up to either 230 or attempt 225 by 11, as you know, that's going to be pretty tough to get that next rep if that 10 is close to failure, right? Given the constraints of the squat. So what they could do is actually drop down to 220 and attempt an 11th rep. And when you punch this in, and controversial thoughts on that 1 rep max calculator, it'll project a higher 1 rep max. Do I want to infer from that I'm actually stronger and I can hit a 1 rep max? I don't care about that. What I care about is the fact that it projects a higher 1 rep max demonstrates that it's probably objectively a little bit harder to do 220 by 11 versus doing 225 by 10. So it's almost like you said, how would we logically explain it? Lifting slightly less weight one more time is harder, right? Because you're going through this whole movement, right? That's a lot of work. So the fact that it's like 11 times slightly less work means it's more work than the 10, if that makes sense. And you can do that. And then when you go back to 225, now you go 11. So it's like 225 by 10, 220 by 11, 225 by 11. And it's still, technically speaking, it's still double progression where you haven't added any volume or any accessories. You've just given yourself a harder task that is progressive, like objectively, but it became more manageable in order to compensate for the fact that you're losing your diminished returns, right? You're
Yeah.
experiencing diminished returns. All right. So what are
Yeah,
your
no,
thoughts on those? What are your thoughts on those?
really, really good. All those are really good points, and I've utilized those like in the past. While you were talking, I was thinking about times either in bodybuilding or powerlifting where I utilize those. So I rather than sort of add my experience, I'll give you some more methods.
Oh yeah,
So
yeah.
so because those are great points. I can't really add anything to those, and I think anyone who's listening would do well to employ those. They're good strategies. So another strategy that I think is quite common for me and my clients is adding rotations in. So adding various rotations of routines. So a very common one, and one that I employ quite a lot, is I no longer work on a 7-day schedule when it comes to my lifting. So me personally, like right now, well, right now it's not the best example of what I'm doing, but let's take an upper lower. Let's take an upper lower. So upper lower routine, people will typically have upper A and upper B, and then just rotate that. So every 7 days, you come back around to the same lift. Now, one thing that I found to be very good for my sort of late stage intermediate clients is after a while, it becomes very difficult to come back to that same exercise. But they can train the same muscle group again, twice a week. But training the same exercise twice a week is a lot less possible. And it goes back to what we said right at the beginning, which was identifying the different recovery systems, muscles, ligaments, tendons, central nervous system. Now, I still want to have effective exercises in my routine. Despite doing a lot in the bodybuilding sphere now, I still, like I said to you earlier, I still think barbells are extremely useful, and they're great exercises, but on more than that, they're really good variations of basic movement patterns. So if I was to choose if I wanted to keep including the basic barbell squat in somebody's routine, but they couldn't do it every 7 days, and I know right now I can't. Even though I used to train very frequently, I can't. It's a lot more palatable for them to include the deadlift or the squat every 10 days, so every week and a half. So then what we would do is we'd have upper A, lower A, and then upper A and lower B, and also upper and lower C. Now, I found for those, that seems to be the most common setup that I've got my clients with, but I've also done things on a 14-day schedule as well, where people have had either upper lower D, which is a lot of variation because you only then train each lift every 2 weeks, but regardless, whether it's every 10 or 14 days, you're still training the muscle just as frequently as you started off with, even just as frequently as a beginner who's doing upper lower, but perhaps only is doing the same lifts over and over again, both. So they only have upper A and they carry on doing upper A again and again. So I've found rotations to be invaluable for making sure you keep the effective exercises in, but you also don't have to compromise on the training frequency of the muscle. And I find that the more variety you do, typically the more volume you can get away with. So that's one way, which is, I don't think that's very controversial, but I'm going to give you another way, which is probably a bit more controversial. But it's something that, again, I only speak from experience, so it's something that I've had personal success with. So back when I temporarily stopped powerlifting for a while because I hurt my hamstring pretty badly in 2007. And for a period of 4 years, I was forced, hand behind my arm, to get into bodybuilding. Didn't like it, didn't want to do it, but I was hurt. Doctor was like, you're not going to powerlift again. It's over. And I suffered a really bad hamstring tear. I came back from Asia. I was traveling for 6 months and backpacking around Asia. I came back untrained and I started to pull some deadlifts and snap with the hamstring. But anyway, I started to go down this road of bodybuilding. And one of the variables that I really liked to do, because it allowed me to use less weight, was decreasing rest periods. Now, this is not something which I've heard people really discuss because, like we were talking about earlier, people are very like pro science. You got to rest 3 minutes. You got to go till you're ready, all that kind of stuff. And it's all BS. You don't have to do that. So I systematically reduced my rest periods for a lot of exercises, but I'll give you the example of the bench press. I started off with a full 3 minutes because I timed my rest periods. Some people might think that's a bit anal, whatever. It's a variable. I tracked it, It's quite easy to do when you have your phone with you. And I mean, this was back in 2007. So I don't think it wasn't my phone. I think it was one of those timers for the...
Yeah, a little stopwatch thing. Yeah.
Those used to be popular. So I just hit time on that. And I started off 3 minute rest periods. I systematically reduced the rest periods from down to 2.5 minutes, 2 minutes, eventually to 45 seconds. So eventually I got to the point where I was lifting 90 kilos, which is only 200 pounds, for 3 sets of 8 with a 45-second rest in between those sets. Now, it doesn't sound like much, but that was enough to allow for those small increases in progression, because every time I reduced the rest periods, I had to fight like hell to get back up to 90 kilos for 3 sets of 8. And I peaked my strength after that because I felt pretty good. And I actually peaked a 330-pound bench off that. So that's pretty crazy. Now, fair enough, I had already benched about that much years prior, so my ligament structure was built up. I wouldn't recommend it, by the way. I don't think people should jump into that, but I was young and I was dumb. But it proves a point. It proves the point that rest periods, just like all the methods that you've identified, just like the rotation that I've identified, hypertrophy is very forgiving, and all you need is additional progressive stimulus. And people get far too hung up on a particular type of stimulus, and people who will say they're not dogmatic get very dogmatic about rest periods, RAR, like you got to train to failure, range of motion, all that kind of stuff, when the reality is it's very forgiving. I feel like as coaches, a lot of our jobs is just to get people to train hard in a way that doesn't get them hurt. But fortunately, we have so many ways of doing that. We don't need to be committed to any one modality. It's a lot more freeing. Bodybuilding is a lot more freeing than powerlifting. I tell you what, powerlifting was tough, man. Like the training was hard. Bodybuilding is a lot more flexible, and people put themselves into these boxes because they listen to either voices or science or whatever. But yeah, rest periods, the most controversial one. But yeah, that's what I did.
No, that's good. That's
I know.
good.
I'll give you one more before.
Sorry. Yeah. Okay, good. I got 3. You got 3. That's fair.
Yeah, range of motion too. Range of motion. I used to get so much crap from my powerlifting friends, but I never used to lock out my bench. Like never.
Oh, yeah.
I would also never really lock out my deadlift. Which I don't think I've ever really told anyone before. So it's a Davin exclusive. So I used to train with a powerlifting crew, and there's this one guy, Aaron, he used to train with me. He used to give me so much shit because whenever I would bench, I would never lock out my bench. I'd just take it to about like here. And I'd come back down. He's like, you got to lock out. You got to lock out. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. He says, you got to lock out. And it was like maybe 90% range of motion. I said, you're never going to lock out on the day. And I was like, well, okay. And deadlifts, I would never lock out either. I'd just come up to like maybe like there-ish, come back down, do my reps. And I would always do touch and go reps. I never really did dead stop reps, not for the majority of my training. And I always use straps. That's another thing he used to give me crap about. It's like, you got to use straps. You always get
all the rules broken.
All the rules, broke all the rules. Right? Young Faz was a rebel. So, but I never missed a bench press at the top. I never missed a deadlift. And also I never missed a deadlift with my grip at all. Also at the time I could double overhand without straps, 4 or 5 plates aside on the deadlift. So my grip strength was incredibly strong. So
that's quite impressive.
Yeah, it's just reasonable. If you know, I mean, thank you for saying it, because I think if you know what you're doing with overhand, double overhand, it is actually quite impressive. But so I could double overhand 5 plates, and it never affected my grip. It never affected my lockout. So the other thing is range of motion. So with regards to like just general training, I'm less and less convinced, Davin, that we actually need full range of motion. And if you're hurt. I'd like to hear your opinion on that. What's your experience is? I think if you're hurt, then maybe reduce it a little bit. And as long as you can stay in the gym, it's the most important thing, right?
I agree with all of that what you just said. Full range of motion can definitely be overrated. If you're hurt, decreasing range of motion literally could save your back or knees or whatever it is. Totally. And as working with Gen Pop, I've had the pleasure, and it's been a very educational experience to work with people with like bad knees. Like some guy will tell me like, hey, my knee surgeon told me it's the worst knee he's ever seen in his entire career as a surgeon. Great, let's work together. Let's see what we can do, And he's doing like sit to stand from a couch where it's like, barely like 90 degrees of a squat. Doesn't hurt, ACL completely gone. Cartilage completely gone. Doesn't matter, if he can get stronger and not have like a bunch of pain and swelling and stuff in his knee, that's a victory. He doesn't need to ATG squat. He needs to lose the weight he wants to lose and get down there and get stronger. And, it's like even Lane Norton said this, you can be weak and be in pain, or you can be strong and be in pain. I'm sure you've accumulated a few aches and pains here and there yourself. I've accumulated, so I'm trying not to accumulate anymore, really pace myself. But that's one lesson I've had to learn anyways, a quick offside is patience, patience.
Definitely.
But yeah, with range of motion, some of the best gains I ever made, I remember I would like impress people in high school, and this is like hilarious. This is like one of the goofiest exercises too. It's like 90 degree or less leg press like that, like I would put a monstrous amount of plates on it, like 5, 6, 7, 800 pounds for reps in high school. And I was like a 16-year-old kid, and I had pretty big thighs. So for anyone that says, even Tom Platz, who I love and adore as like a bodybuilding inspiration,
Yeah.
it does nothing. No, Tom. It eventually, if you work hard enough, it does do something, and it's very impressive what it'll do. But eventually, I hurt my back on that, not because of necessarily the weight or the range of motion, but the actual leg press itself. Those back pads you sit on. This thing was like, I mean, probably a 50-year-old machine, 40-year-old machine. So it was really worn out. So there was a spot where my scrawny little back, my vertebrae was touching metal. And when you're doing that with hundreds of pounds, eventually that's not good. So I think I did something, never really got it looked at. It's something that I've nursed here and there with my technique and recovery. It hasn't hurt me too bad, but like the only time I ever hurt myself was a faulty piece of equipment doing that minimal range of motion. Like I said, I would get it like just under 90 degrees and then boom. And I would go heavy all the time, as often as possible, twice a week. And I just got stronger and stronger and stronger, bigger and bigger. And I've noticed that on a lot of exercises, like one I've just started doing, I think less than a month ago, I take the pec fly machine, the one where you actually grab handles and it's like adjustable. And I take the little thing where you can spin it back around to reduce the range of motion. I reduce it drastically. Then I lean forward and I hug it. So I cheat, right? Like I'm not using the handles. I actually get the bar around my forearm and I grab it like it's a pec deck. Yeah. But because it's adjustable and pec decks, when they're not that adjustable, they kind of suck. Getting in this awkward position, that's not comfortable. I used to hate it.
I do it like that as well.
Yeah. But when I grab the pec fly and I treat it like a pec deck, but adjustable, that small range of motion, when I squeeze my elbows together, it just lights up my chest. It's the best pump I've ever had in my life. So it's like minimal range of motion, very effective if the hard work is there. That's what it needs, right? So who am I to say more range of motion is worse or not desirable in some cases? I think in many cases it is desirable to increase the range of motion in a relative sense, but to maximize it, I don't know that should be really anyone's end goal.
I'll say this, Davin, we may well get like either cancelled or a lot of angry commentators because the stuff we've been talking about over the last 10 minutes has been very different to what is bandied around, right? Maximum range of motion, you got to train to failure, all that kind of stuff. But it's really nice to hear you talking about stuff like that. And again, like I said to you earlier on, one of the reasons I like your content is you come across as a coach, not a YouTuber. And I mean that as the biggest compliment because as much as I'm on YouTube, I don't consider myself a YouTuber in a traditional sense. Like I'm a coach. I've said this on loads of times on my channel. And so what tends to happen is you will find solutions for people who are injured, whatever, and they might look unconventional. And it works, So yeah, I think the range of motion thing is something which I am going to do a video on.
Good.
I've kind of identified it as like the 4 R's. So range of motion, rest periods. What was it again? Range of motion, rest periods, reps, and RAR. Yeah. Range of motion, rest period, reps, and RAR. Yeah. And I want to do a video on all 4 of those because those are things that I've experimented with. I mean, the example I gave you of the bench press, that was back in 2007. So I've been experimenting with this for almost 2 decades. Range of motion is more recent, I would say. Although I guess if we count my powerlifting days, maybe it's not so recent. Repetitions are more recent. I'm targeting much higher reps for certain things and certain people. And RAR, I think is something which I've never been a huge believer in this idea that we have to train to failure or also the conversely, the other thing that 0 to 2 RAR is the same. Like, I don't think it is, but I think again, it's not a case of
Dr. Mike, I'm sorry. I love Dr. Mike, but when he's like, there's no difference between 3 in reserve and 0. Pretty sure there is.
Pretty sure there is. Well, that's the thing we know now there is. But I think with that, I think this is where it's like it's the wrong question because it's more a case of, well, what can that person do? So rather than trying to fit itself in a box, I mean, I think it's less relevant, when you're young. I don't know how old you are, Davin, but like
24.
I'm 24. Yeah. So I'm 42 on Sunday. And my body is very different to what it was, even I would say in my early 30s. I was able to train squats, benches, and deadlift multiple times a week, heavy. Yeah. Like I can't even squat more than every 10 days now. It's like your body changes, And I think when you look at these recommendations, which are given as like the gospel, maybe that's a little bit facetious, but when you look at these recommendations, which are given as good average recommendations, who's average? We all have injuries, we all have situations, we all have who's average really. You're looking at the people in these studies who are typically young, sometimes trained, sometimes untrained, but unencumbered with injuries most of the time. But also as a broad average, most of us aren't average, So I think I would urge people, just like we've been talking about this entire time, to really find what works for them. And it's such a cliche when people say that, but it's so bloody true. And so if you're looking at the recommendations for say 10 to 20 sets per week, and you're thinking like, I've got to try and push it, I really want to work hard, I don't do 20 sets, even when I was powerlifting, I don't think I did 20 sets per week. And I think you just have to figure out like what allows you to progress. And what I said in my recent video on volume was start with the lowest amount that lets you progress. Like, get what you can, milk it, but because progression is all that matters. It doesn't matter. And just like you've been saying, range of motion, who cares? Progression matters. Yep. Yeah, no, it's a really interesting conversation. I think it's certainly going to run counter to. I think people are going to comment that okay, it's obvious. Like we get it, guys. It's obvious, but I don't think it is obvious. It's obvious when you think about it. Somebody like we present it, but I don't think it's obvious to the large majority of the community. I think the large majority of the community are still stuck on 10 to 20 sets, train to failure, maximum ROM, 3-minute rest periods or 5-minute rest periods. I think there's a lot of scope to individualize within that.
Oh yeah, 100%, 100%. Now, one thing I'll say, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. You mentioned what it sounds like a cliche, but find what works for you, and I totally agree. But also, I would consider this research. Look at what works for people and put that in your bank of information of things that work. Period. Definitely. Right? Like it's like, hey, if that worked, I could try it. Maybe he's built different. Maybe injuries. Blah blah blah. But if I just ignore the differences for a moment, maybe I could at least try the method. And maybe it's not as simple as a exercise selection. Maybe that's more leverage dependent in some cases. But like as far as, hey, I modified the range of motion. Here's what I was looking to achieve on each set. Here's how many I did. Yeah, go for it. People are so quick to knock a certain type of program, a certain frequency, a certain this and that. And, I'm sure you've heard it all, right? Between the 5-day a week bench presses and then there's the Mike Menser forced rep where it's not just one set. It's one set plus a partner assisted thing and a 15-second hold and then a fight the eccentric. And okay, well, it's like Mike is like very clearly trying to turn one set into not really one set. It's like 1.5 or 1 3/4.
Yeah, just do another set, bro.
Yeah, it's like
yeah, no, it's a good point. I think it's an interesting conversation. I like the way this conversation is going because I think we can tell people just look, there's no rules, like do what you like, experiment. But like I found out when I was a school teacher, like you do have to model something. So like recommendations are useful in a sense because they at least give a starting point. So I could explain a concept to somebody or a classroom full of students, but unless I model it on the blackboard or on my computer, it's going to be very difficult for them to sometimes visualize exactly what I'm saying. So I do see the value in modeling some things. Right. I guess what I would say is to your point, very much to your point, I like this conversation. All I would say is do try and not to get too caught up in a very small sliver of the recommendations. Broaden it out, and try a few things. You have a lifetime. I mean, I know you've got a lifetime. I mean, I've been training 25 years. I don't think if I'm going to stop anytime soon, and I'm still experimenting. So yeah, I think I like the way that you phrase that because it takes the conversation into another path, and that is, yes, experiment. There are no rules, but at the same time, you do have to start somewhere, and we could probably run it through. I mean, I think volume is the big one. Maybe volume and intensity are the big ones, right? Maybe frequency as well. So I'll give you my thoughts on volume because I did a video on volume recently and kind of like where I roughly talk about once you're past the beginner stage, because I think we've already established that. So I've seen once you're past the beginner stage, roughly 8 to 14, maybe 16 sets as the very, very top end. So 8 to 16 sets per body part per week, I've seen as a decent broad average, rather than 10 to 20. I've seen that a little bit lower. And 16 is very freaking high. So yeah, what are your thoughts on that? We can kind of go.
I would also consider 16 very high. Yeah. And this is not to push back on you, but someone who would present 10 to 20 as like a hard, fast rule based on science is my biggest objection is, boy, that's a big range. 10 to 20
Yeah.
is a big range.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I would definitely lean closer to like the 10 being the upper end of what's sensible, especially if we're talking about per exercise, per muscle, maybe above 10, right? Maybe 12 to 15, something like that. But realistically, what I most often do these days for clients, is like 4 to 6, maybe 8, and even for myself, some of my things I'm doing 2 sets a week, 3 sets a week, and it's working really well. It's working really well. Like triceps, I gave myself triceps tendonitis with a really bad program where it's kind of like what you had mentioned. This is such a great thing you pointed out. Maximize everything. I had a program like 2.5 years ago where I was basically trying to maximize everything. I was like, got to overhead press, got to go hard, 3 sets to failure. Bench press, got to do this, and then I got to do decline press, and then I got to do the triceps, and I destroyed my elbows. And I've been living with that ever since. And what came out of that was like almost like a powerlifting mindset where I really went heavy, like reps that were, let's say, 6 or fewer, multiple times per week, every week. So I nursed an old injury by pounding it. And I've got long arms. Like, I don't know if my height exceeds my wingspan exceeds my height, but I'm 5'10", so I wouldn't be surprised if my wingspan's 5'11" or 6 feet. I got long arms. So I'm pounding these elbows that never really had a chance to fully recover with heavy weight. What have I changed since then? I don't obsess over variations as much. The volume's dropped, and when I bench press, it's more like an 8 to 12 range, and I'm really enjoying that. And you know what? That works better for me. So if that's the case, so you can get more out of less than do it. My triceps, I do 2 sets of triceps push downs every Tuesday, and that's it. It's tricep Tuesday. I do my triceps on Tuesday. I don't do it on Thursday or Friday or anything else. And you know what? I push it hard. It's high reps. It's like 20 to 30 reps on the push down. And also, it's not even full range of motion. I just go from like 90 degrees down and hold the squeeze for a second and come back up. And that's it. And it works. It feels really good. It's the only tricep exercise like this pain, like all these different skull crushers and things. Pain. That one doesn't hurt. That's why I do it. And I like
That's
it.
great. Yeah, great. That's fantastic. Yeah. And I think when it comes to frequency, so my preference is more than once a week. I think, I think it's the thing about hypertrophy training. It is a very forgiving endeavor, like we say. But I think if I was to give somebody like a broad prescription, like this conversation is now steering on to like broad recommendations. Yes, everything works, whatever, right? But I think if we were to give broad recommendations, I would say between 2 to 3 is average. 4 is fine. I personally, at the moment, I'm training everybody about 5 days a week because I'm doing full body quite often, but that's very specialized and there's a lot going on there. Like at least 2 of those days are like recovery days. So I'm really only training a body part. Like,
that's what I was about to ask you is on those days, does the effort decrease in order to compensate for the high frequency?
So it's like the loading, the exercise selection and the loading is a lot easier. The effort is still high. They're still training to failure on the last set. But it's on very, very joint friendly exercises. So like, for example, if we take the quads, I will do across the week, I'll do a squat variation, a leg press variation, and a machine squat variation. But then in between will be sandwiched high repetition, short rest period, leg extensions. So they're basically recovery work. So yes, but you are still getting some growth stimulus because the last set's taken to failure, which is one of the reasons why I find full body training so the way that I promote it to be so effective. But anyway, going back to frequency, I think 2 or 3 times like a good, if we were to lay down some rules, good average. I think 1's fine. I think 4's also okay. More than that's also okay. But if we are going into that part of the conversation about talking about broad guidelines, I'd say 2 or 3. What do you think to that?
Well, here's how I'll present it. And it might sound like a bit of a cop-out, but I'll try and make it logical. And then I'll say what I do for my clients. Because what I say conceptually, what I think works, is, obviously based on experience and what other people will tell me and what I can learn and think about and so forth. But at the end of the day, as you know, as a coach, we have to make decisions. And as Sam Sheether would say, we're professional, educated guessers. So we're going to see what works. We're going to play it cautious. And then when it works, we can build from that, just like science, right? You build a body of information that informs future decisions.
Yeah. Right.
But either way, going into frequency, I like the way you presented that in the sense where you said 2 to 3 was average. Here's how I would categorize types of frequency. If I were to say low, high, or low, medium, high. I would say low frequency is once per week or less. And for us to go, wait a minute, what do you mean less? Well, hey, we were just talking about, a little while back, doing something, the ABCD rotation. You could do something once every 2 weeks, or whatever that exact rotation is, right? You can technically do, some people have an 8-day program. That's something Baldoni Man's talking about, and other people. So technically, yes, you can do something less than once per week. So 0 to 1 times per week, that's low frequency in my view. 2 to 3 is medium. And that's where my preference is. That's where I would say, yes, I gave the example of my triceps. I think that's the only exercise right now I train once per week. Everything else is 2 or 3 times per week, and I really enjoy that. I would say most of them are 2 and not 3, and that's for like recovery reasons, not just like preference. I would say 2 to 3 is like a good like average to medium. And also that's usually what I give my clients is the 2 to 3 times per week. Now what would I call high frequency? 4 or more. Right. So you're talking about 5 days per week, 4 days per week, 6. Some people do some kind of work 7 days a week. Anything that's 4 or higher, I would consider high. Now, so I already had mentioned that my preference is that middle range. Same with my clients. They seem to enjoy it and get good results and not have recovery issues. But the context of that is just like I've mentioned before, and we've talked about, the rest of your program is the context for any prescription you make. So it's like, hey, if you want to do 2 to 3 times per week, the rest of your program better reflect that. Whereas when you do those sets, the effort better be justified by the volume. If it's low volume, it has to be high effort. If it's low effort, it has to be higher volume, or can be, right? Maybe not have to, but can be, right? It opens the door and also gives you incentive to do more or less based on that tug and pull between effort and volume. Effort meaning percent effort, that is.
Yeah. No, I completely agree.
And with the high volume, just to finish off, is just be careful, right? If you try and match the effort and the volume of the person, or per session volume and the per set effort of the person who does less and less, and you try and do that 5, 6, 7 days a week, you might begin to really hurt yourself. So just make it all make sense, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think the only thing I'd add on to that as a different point, because I agree with what you said there, is you've got to really earn the higher echelons of frequency, volume, and intensity by making sure your food and your sleep are in order as well. So you got to kind of earn that. Like if you want to maximize everything, well, you better damn well be maximizing your diet and your sleep as well. I think that's I think that's that. So yeah, moving on to intensity.
Yeah,
this is an interesting one, you see, because again, I think it's a nuanced thing. My general recommendation is for people to train to failure, simply because it seems to be self-correcting. Like I have a few advanced clients, right? I would say, like I've had guys over the last year, I've had about 400-pound benches.
Wow.
Some really strong guys. Thomas, there's a few really strong ones, and like big benchers, big squatters, big deadlifters. But the vast majority aren't there. Like the vast majority are in the intermediate range, and you get some beginners. So it kind of becomes self-correcting, because a beginner, I want them to train as hard as possible, as long as it's not on like a barbell movement, because I don't want them to fail with a barbell on their chest.
Sloppy reps, get stuck, all that stuff.
Sloppy reps as well. So for the beginner, it's kind of less important. It's more important just to work hard. I don't really mind not seeing them train to failure. For the intermediate, one of the reasons that people tend to come to me is because, well, they've stalled in their progress. So it's up to me to kind of identify, well, what's going wrong? Like what is keeping you where I was? Like what is keeping you at a 90-kilo bench press, or a 200-pound bench, or a 300-pound squat? Why are we not progressing up? And those are arbitrary standards, so people watching don't get caught up on those. I'm just saying what keeps you here and not here.
That's right.
And I have to kind of identify that. So one of the things which does tend to be lacking is effort. And this is not to disparage anyone, because I was there as well. One of the most important things that any of my coaches, I've had lots of coaches over the years, have taught me is effort. That is how hard you can push a set, and open my mind to just how much you can put your body through. And I would never have achieved the numbers I achieved without that type of perspective. Just to go off on a bit of a tangent, I remember something my old coach told me was this guy called Tom Martin. He's a very, very He's a hugely strong lifter in England. He was the guy who ended up beating Ed Cohen's 35-year-old junior deadlift record. He's the guy who took it. So Tom is ridiculously strong. He's a deadlift expert. He's fantastic. But one of the things he said to me about coaching for powerlifting was people don't really like strength. They think they do. They don't really want to be strong because they don't understand what it means to be strong. And this is one of the problems I have with powerbuilding as well, is people don't really want strength. So the type of strength that I'm talking about, the 4-plate benches, the 300 kilo deadlifts, the 255 squats, that's real strength. People don't really want that. And he said to me once, he said, when people ask me about getting strong, he says what he wishes he could make them feel is the amount of pain he's in one day of the week. And so they could experience just what he goes through on a daily basis and say to them, that amount of pain for these results, is it worth it to you? Is that worth it? And if it's not, fine, then what we've been discussing for the last 2 hours is your thing, right? Be nuanced, be individual, reduce your range of motion, increase your reps, do things for hypertrophy, but you're not cut out for strength. So when people sort of say they want to be strong, I don't think they truly understand what strength is. And you can get stronger in a bodybuilding routine. You don't have to get stronger on a powerlifting routine. You don't have to do strength training in the way that I did it to get strong. It can just be a case of, I mean, Sam Shethar, he's ridiculously strong as well. He'll tell you, I mean, some days he probably hurts like hell. You know, it's a very, very different thing. So that's what he said, and I forget where I was going with this, but I think that's a
and actually, Sam did say, I think he said this on one of the parts of the episode as well. It's like, by the way, for the audience, I don't feel good.
Right? Yeah, you don't, man. I completely relate.
Yeah,
I remember the sessions when I was at my absolute peak. There were times, Davin, where after I finished a session, I would sit and stare at a wall for an hour, and it wasn't consciously done. It wasn't conscious. Like I would sit and stare at the wall for an hour. And then I would look down at my watch after a while, after coming out of this sort of coma, and it'd be like an hour later. And I'm like, I need to get up now. But I just would. There was one time when I was lifting this. Oh, I know where I was going with this. I was talking about training intensity. There was one time when I was lifting, and it was a squat session, a brutally hard squat session. I was doing hard fives, and I sit down on my chair between squat sets, and I got up and I heard something pop in my inner thigh above the music, right? And I messaged Tom and I said, look, I've hurt myself. He goes, okay, fair enough. Stretch it out and see how it feels tomorrow. And I was like, what are you talking about? You know, I'm hurt. Like I heard it pop. And he's like, just stretch it out, see how it feels tomorrow. And so I stretched it out. A couple of days later, I went back and I squatted again and it was fine. There was no injury. That was my mind playing tricks on me. You can work so hard like that you will literally hear, I'm not recommending people do this, right? But you can hear shit go wrong. And it's your brain telling you to stop. Normal people don't get to that point. I'm pretty sure Sam's probably experienced something like that before, but normal people don't get to that point. So when people tell me, look, I value strength as well as size, like, no, you fucking don't, man. Like, just be a bodybuilder. Like, you're not cut out for this. So learning intensity, I think is, and so when people say, you know, like I train hard, it's like, you don't understand yet what training hard is. And I don't mean that in like an ego-driven way, but the level of intensity of some guy who's benching 3 plates or like two plates or whatever, it's not the same as people who are at those upper echelons who are really pushing it. The most important lesson that any coach has ever taught me, like Tom, you can work harder. So you have to be humble about these things. You can. And if you've never been up to upper echelons of strength or physique, you can't sit there and say, well, I'm working hard enough. Like, you don't know. Maybe you're hard enough for getting results and that's fine. But if it's what's missing out of the formula, if it's the missing piece of the puzzle, and I'm telling you, okay, maybe we need to push this a little bit, you have to be humble at that respect and go, okay, maybe I can work harder. And it's not a detriment to your character. It's just opening your mind up to saying, it's like not being dogmatic. It's just opening your mind up to saying, look, I probably can up the intensity a little bit. And I had to do that many times. And you know what? Most of the time, you're fine. Most of the time you get it right. You try again and you're good. You improve. Maybe one time out of 20, you get hurt. But that is the line you walk when you're pushing the limits. But normal people aren't going to get to that point. My point was just simply with regards to intensity. I try and get most of my clients to train to failure because typically speaking, they are nowhere near failure. Because even if they're actually failing, they could push harder and get the rep rather than fail through a lack of like real white lightning hot focus. Am I making sense? Because I know this is some fairly
Yeah. No. Well, here's a good way of pointing it out. I love having this discussion of the variables and things like that, talking about strength and size, and I love hearing how people define it, right? Because it seems to me that you have a perspective on strength, and this is very reasonable because this is what competitions are surrounded by, is maximal strength, right? Like to you, being strong is best defined and exemplified in the 1 rep max, or in the set of 5, in the set of 3, whatever it is. It's very heavy, right?
No,
Yeah.
not that. It's more that you don't need specialized methods to get a reasonable level of strength. So when people say they want to be strong, just be a bodybuilder. You will get strong. As strong as you want, you'll do it. That's all. Yeah. Which is why I push back against the power building thing. It's like, you don't really want to be strong, and just regular training will get you to where you want to go.
So if that's what strength means to them, then what would you say strength means to you? Or at least what did it mean in the peak of your powerlifting?
It's elite strength. That's what it is. Because that elite strength requires, because that's what requires specialized methods. So the point is, the difference is what requires a different method. Right. And that is elite strength. So then, cool, great. Do your powerlifting, do your specific strength training. But if your only desire is to have above average strength, like a 3-plate bench, a 4-plate squat, just do your bodybuilding. You don't need anything special. You don't need to be a power builder. You don't need all that kind of stuff. You don't really value strength. So it's a case of what do you value? What is appropriate to you? And what method gets you there? That's all. This is why I just say, for most people, they don't really want strength, so they don't need specialized methods. They just want to be stronger than the average guy, look good on the beach, and get stronger on a weekly basis. You don't need massively special methods for that. Be a bodybuilder, do things safely. You'll be less injured as well.
Yep.
Don't slap a label on yourself and some special made-up name. Just bodybuild like the rest of us and get stronger that way. When you actually truly want to be strong, there are specialized methods to get there, which Sam employs, which I employ, which Tom employed, and that's when you get to talk about those things. Up until that point, you're just cosplaying as a strong lifter. You're not, I just value. I think it's important to value the truth. Like, we shouldn't pretend to be things we're not. It's just not good. And and this is why often competitors who have been at that level, they will have very strong points of view about this, because it's like, you just see a bunch of normies just like pretending that they like strength. It's like, bro, you don't know. It doesn't what it means. It's fucking hard. So
the nature of the cost of building up to and maintaining elite strength is so much higher than just going from a 135 to 225 bench, that it's not even worth calling it the same thing. It's basically
and I know it's going to come across as very sort of condescending to people in the audience, maybe, but I just hope people understand my point of view. This is why I push back against those terms, because regular bodybuilding training will get you to where you want to be. You don't need to be a power builder. You don't need like this and that. What you really want to do is just be stronger than the average person. So just employ regular techniques, and that'll get you there. That's it. You don't need to cosplay as a strength athlete, because doing that, then if you're going to do that, then put the work in and actually put
instead of watching a bunch of, you have a queue of videos by people who are like elite power lifters, and it's like, these 3 cues blew up my bench, and it's like, his definition of blowing up his bench is getting the next 10 pounds once he's already benching 430. To him, that's blowing up his bench. You don't need to hear these 3 technique cues. You need a bench.
Well, it's like when people say Dan Green, like he's I want to be like Dan Green because he looks jacked. It's like, no, you don't. Trust me. Dan Green's in a lot of pain. He's in a lot of pain. Like the rest of us, he's in a lot of pain. Like Sam, like I was 10 years ago, because it's freaking hard. Like, you don't want to be like that. People will look at these like elite bodybuilders, elite powerlifters who have got abs, and go, oh, well, he's a power builder, so I want to be like him. It's like, no, you don't. You don't. Trust me. You don't have what it takes. You don't. So it sounds very condescending. It sounds very sort of like,
I don't think so. I think it's realistic. I think it's realistic.
Yeah, it's realistic.
Deadlifting 700 hurts more than deadlifting 500, which hurts more than deadlifting 400, right? Like, it's
and I mean, that's the thing. So Yeah, I think that's why it's so misunderstood, and I think that's why my views are so misunderstood. It's just very rare that I see other competitors. I mostly see non-competitors like argue against it, like my views. Most competitors that I know,
Oh yeah.
they're very passionate about they're defending what they did because they
And
know
they
they
also
went
know what
above
you're
and beyond.
talking about. They understand what you're saying.
Yeah, yeah, they know it because they went above and beyond. Like you ask, like Alex Bromley, for example, he's a competitor at a very high level. It's just a very different kettle of fish. My training now, it's not the same as what I was doing 10 years ago. My body's not the same. Um, I look back at that training now, I just think it just makes me sick to think about it. I couldn't do it. It
The
was horrible,
torture.
Davin.
Yeah.
Yeah, dude. Like it's unusual to hit those numbers. You know, it's not normal. So you can't have a normal disposition. And I think people cosplay it. That's all. They just pretend to be it. So, and I don't like that. Again, I value the truth. I value people being realistic. But yeah, we'll get
100%.
into that. We're getting into that talk
Oh,
again.
that's good. That's good. But I guess reining it back into
Mm,
intensity. Well, I
yeah.
think personally, there's three kind of factors that determine like kind of the safety and sustainability of it, and how I approach intensity to myself versus my clients, because it is going to be different, right?
Mm,
Like as you know, like you're in control yourself. Whatever sacrifice and risk you're willing to take on is different than the person who's paying you just to lose 8 inches off their waist, or
mm,
lose however many pounds, and build a decent frame of muscle, and like you said, above average strength. They're not looking for that elite thing, and even in the
yeah.
bodybuilding sense or body image sense, they're not trying to be stage ready and spray tan in a
Yeah.
bikini, but they
Mm,
do want to look better and feel better about themselves. So that's a different animal. But the three factors I think that really are relevant with intensity: absolute. And I think absolute intensity, as far as like how heavy is the weight, is
mm,
extremely relevant, because, as you're saying, elite level strength. What are we talking about? Absolute strength. Being strong enough to bench 405 or 500 is very different than when your max bench is 250. It's double, right? It's
mm.
double. That's a lot more weight sitting in your hands. The risk is higher. The recovery cost per set, per session is higher. People can say, this is another one of the things that makes me cringe. In addition to the range of motion, is like the body is adaptable, the joints are adaptable. Yes, but do you really believe for 1 second that your tendons and ligaments and all these little fine things
Mm,
are going to adapt proportionally to your muscle?
yeah,
I'm not convinced that as my muscles get stronger, my tendons get equally stronger. I don't
yeah,
believe that for a minute. They probably do get stronger, and noticeably so. And like you said
yeah.
about being detrained and then you came back and you tore your hamstring, that's relevant, right? That's relevant to tendon strength and all that stuff. But either way, we are foolish if we think that our body's joints and soft tissues are able to proportionally keep up with muscles. That's foolish. So absolute strength, how heavy is the load
Mm,
objectively, is very relevant, especially when we compare beginners to advanced.
totally agree.
Secondly, when we talk about like the like, I guess, percentages, I don't really program by percentages, but like
Mm,
really, are we talking about something you could do 5 times with one in reserve, or
yeah,
something you could do 12 times to failure? Like that's very different. It's a different amount of your strength. I think that is very relevant to whether or not the person goes to failure, how many sets they do, what particular exercise is best suited for it. Preacher
mm,
curl isn't suited for a set of 5, in my opinion.
yeah,
Lateral
yeah,
raises, not well suited for a set of 5. That's just the nature of the movement. That doesn't mean that there's never a place for it. But as you've talked about in your recent experience, you've been going lighter. You've been going lighter on
mm,
exercises, and I've been going lighter on compounds. And for all people say, heavy compound, heavy compound. I love heavy compounds, but right now for me, heavy compound for overhead press means 12 to 15 rep range. What it means for me, Faz, why I like that right now, is it means for whatever issues I have in my back, there's the likelihood that I compensate from holding the weight is much lower because the weight's lower. And when I do the reps, they're smooth. It's like
mm.
butter. Versus if I try and do 8 reps, the last two are just,
Yeah, yeah,
I'm grinding it. And if I do something weird with my shoulder blade, then I'm feeling something in one of my muscles for 2 days, and I'm like, why'd I have to go so heavy on that? Lighten it up. So the percentage matters, the absolute load matters, and then I guess you could say like that the effort, like as you would say, like is it to failure or not? Because obviously, if you do a set of 5 with 5 in reserve, looks very different than it's 5 with 1 in reserve.
oh
Totally
yeah,
different ball game, right?
mm,
So it's not just the number; it's what that number means, and then also the absolute load. I think all those things are relevant, and how that plays into how I program for clients. They're not going to be near their 1 rep max. Like even if someone's doing a set of 6, they've got a good amount of reps in reserve such that their technique is really good and they don't end up, obviously they're nowhere near as strong as Faz, but I want to avoid the scenario that Faz is talking about where it's like staring at a wall for an hour. Like any type of scenario like that where someone's like having to like get chiropractor adjustments the next day and like jackhammer their spine to loosen things up because of how hardcore their deadlift session is. People aren't paying me to do that. They don't want that. Even if obviously they're nowhere near that level of strength where that kind of thing's relevant, that analogy. But point is, it's not productive for normies to spend a lot of time, in my opinion, near their 1 rep max. It's
Yeah,
really
I totally agree.
so that's where we go. And then to failure is like as long as the movement, the rep range, and the rep quality is sufficient and makes sense, boom, go to failure.
Yeah.
Or don't.
I like what you said about the loading mattering, because I think this is I also don't use percentages as well for that reason. That like 80% for a guy who's very strong is going to be very different for 80% from a guy who's not. And so I think that actually affects everything. I know we're talking about it with intensity, but I think it affects everything. You know, if you're a very, very strong individual, probably the amount of volume you can do will change too. And then you get into a conversation about matching volume. So like guys who are very, very strong and they're like my bodybuilding clients, physique clients, they will probably do a smaller percentage of barbell lifts in their program, smaller to zero, and much more from other sources. Whereas a beginner, I really like big heavy basics for beginners, like a barbell bench multiple times a week, definitely, because it just allows for loading. I actually did a video recently on like should you deadlift or not, and one of my points was I think when you're a beginner, I think people give up deadlifts too soon because I think it's a heavy hip hinge and it really gets your entire backside strong. And I think there's a lot of value in that. I think people sometimes move to RDLs like way too quickly. I did get some pushback on that. And there was a guy who was very, very respectful in the audience, very nice guy, in the comments who said he prefers movements with a stretch. And he said that conventional lifts are, I think he said they're trash. But I think that is somewhat discounting the importance of the load. So I think loading is significant, and so with a beginner who can probably only deadlift, say, 185 pounds, to get them to an RDL, I don't think is as productive because loading matters. Like, yes, stretch is great, but loading matters. So I think we have to have kind of a bit of both. So I really like the big heavy basics, and the bench press and deadlift are great examples. The squat, I would say I'm kind of like less passionate about for beginners, simply because it's kind of harder to teach sometimes, Yeah, it's one of those. It's tricky, isn't it? But like deadlifts, usually people can pull pretty well. As long as they can get the spine under control, and bench, it's almost always acceptable.
There's also a mental barrier. Have you found that with coaching people on the back squat? There's a mental barrier to doing it.
Yeah, for sure. It can be tough. Like we've been saying throughout the entire podcast, it's a case of finding the solution to the problem and what works without being dogmatic. So, yeah, I have my preferences. I think. But they're only preferences because I think they work better. And, but if somebody really can't squat, either a mental block or whatever, and some people just can't deadlift very well. Some people don't have that level of spinal control, So I'll build them up with exercises which support their back in an arch position so that further down the line, they can do good mornings, they can do deadlifts and all that kind of stuff. But that's part of coaching, isn't it? It's finding solutions. Yeah. But yeah, all of this is very contextual. Yeah, it's great. It's a good discussion.
No, I've really enjoyed this discussion. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Are there any final topics you'd like to finish up on today? Anything that you really want to get off your chest? Anything that rubs you the wrong way, or something that you want to encourage the audience? Maybe final words for them.
Well, I think this has been a really great talk. I think people can get a lot of value from. I think people can get a lot of value from this above and beyond a lot of the general recommendations. Not to kind of blow our horns too much, but I think this was a very, very productive talk, and I think it gives people an insight into. From two guys who basically do this for a living and work with people day in, day out, I think this gives people an insight into what they should be looking for in terms of like general guidelines. It really is very nuanced, and I think it's good to start with a broad recommendation. Always bear in mind your loyalty should only be to your results. It should not be to finally, following anything blind. And I mean, I said it right at the beginning, but one of the things I like about your content is you say that a lot, and like it's a very good theme. So yeah, the final closing thoughts. Really good discussion. And I do hope people kind of take a lot of value from what we've said and really take it up to heart, because it comes from practitioners, which is super important. And yeah, let's get some timestamps and make sure this is all ready for people. So
man.
yeah, I know, right? I think this has been absolutely fantastic.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I think there's a ton of value in this, and part of the problem that maybe you've heard me talk about this is even when people offer solutions to problems, there's not enough context, and then how do we work it into the big picture? I think we took specific nuanced approaches and specific solutions and then explained why they work in the big picture. And now that people understand why, they can actually place their trust in it and hopefully get some great results from it. So yeah, it's been absolutely a pleasure to talk to you. So guys, if you haven't already subscribed to Faz, go and follow him on Instagram and give him a sub on YouTube. This is a great discussion. If you're ever interested in doing another one, by the way, in the future, I'd love to have you on again. So,
well, just with that, thank you very much for having me on. Really enjoyed the chat, and yeah, we'll definitely do it again. So
awesome. Now, one more question before you go: are you taking on any clients for anyone who might be interested in hiring you?
Yeah, so I have a couple of ways you can work with me. I do one-to-one coaching like most people do, but I have another option, which is a coaching group. So there are a couple of different price points. So if one-to-one coaching isn't quite your bag or whatever, there is another option at a lower price point. So I have a range of options for different budgets that people can work with me on. So feel free to get in touch. And yeah, currently I do have spaces. The coaching group has only just started a couple of months ago, so it's very productive at the moment. So yeah, get in touch, hit me up on Instagram, YouTube. I have some links in my Instagram, or you can just DM me, it's fine. But yeah, great. No, feel free to get in touch, and happy to work with you.
Okay. Fantastic. He comes highly recommended, folks. Check him out.